Hello everyone, I am the Creeps Cabin. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. It was freshman year of high school, around 2007, when I first heard about OM. Steve, one of my good friends back then, had this tendency to tell us stories that straddled the line between wild exaggeration and pure unsettling truth. Most of the time, we would laugh it off or brush it aside as just another tall tale. But there was this one night, after school in the cafeteria, when he told us about his brother Tim's experience on a trip to New Hampshire that still makes my stomach churn when I think about it. Tim was in college at the time, studying somewhere in New Hampshire. One night, around 2 a.m., Tim and his best friend decided they needed Dunkin' Donuts. It was strange, but I guess you know how it goes. Sometimes you just need a Dunkin' Donuts coffee. Only problem was, the nearest Dunkin' Donuts wasn't anywhere close. It was over the state line, a good distance away. But they were young, fueled by that late-night craving and maybe some caffeine-induced bravado. So they figured, why not? So they packed into Tim's car and started the drive. The route they took involved some narrow highways that went through stretches of dense woods. Tim said it was dark, real dark, like the kind of blackness that seemed to swallow up the headlights, leaving just a tunnel of road. They didn't think much of it at first. Just the two of them, driving through rural New Hampshire, cracking jokes, listening to the radio. Then they hit a strange stretch where the road felt almost too empty. No other cars, no lights except the beams from their own vehicle. Tim and his friend reached Dunkin' Donuts, grabbed their coffee, and turned around to head back. They were coming back on the same road, the same dark, deserted stretch through the woods. Tim said they'd been driving for a while when something odd happened. A red compact car suddenly appeared in front of them. It wasn't like it was coming from an oncoming lane. It just appeared, as if it had been sitting there waiting, maybe hidden in the shadows of the trees. At first, Tim thought it was just another car out for a late-night drive. But then, it didn't act like any car he had ever seen. The red car had no markings on it. No brand, no decals, no identifying features at all, just a blank body. But the strangest part, the one that stuck with Tim, even as he recounted the story to us, was the license plate. It had two characters on it, a black O and a green M. That was all. Just OM. Tim said the whole vibe from that car was off, like a bad energy or something. The way it seemed to appear out of nowhere gave him the chills. He and his friend kept going, trying to ignore it, but it wasn't easy. The weirdness started when Tim noticed the car wasn't driving like a normal car. It wasn't pulling over, wasn't slowing down, wasn't moving with any kind of casual rhythm you'd expect from someone out for a drive. And that's when it started, the coincidences. Tim's phone lost service. He tried to make a call, but the signal just vanished. His jazz station, which had been playing normal tunes before, suddenly started blaring Nirvana's "Smells Like Teen Spirit." And as weird as that seemed, Tim didn't know what to make of it. Maybe it was just random, a strange mix-up with radio signals and static. But the feeling he got, the feeling that something wasn't right, that stayed with him. The red car kept following them. The thing that really freaked Tim out was how the car didn't just pass them. Instead, it matched their speed. At first, Tim thought maybe it was just another driver, not paying attention, or even just someone in a hurry like they were. But when Tim let off the gas, the red car did the same. When he sped up to pass, so did it. Whatever was in that car was keeping pace, matching every move Tim made. Tim glanced over at his friend, and they both knew. Something was off. It wasn't just a coincidence anymore. It wasn't just some guy on the road. It was deliberate. They were being followed. At this point, they both started to panic, but they didn't know what to do. Tim said his heart was pounding, adrenaline flooding his system. They reached a bend in the road, a sharp curve up ahead. Tim decided, in a moment of panic, to just stop, not completely, but slow down to a crawl. His thinking was that if they just pulled over, maybe they could stop this strange game. Maybe the car would just pass them. They sat there in the dark, engines idling, waiting for the red car to move on. Tim said it felt like forever, but in reality, it was probably only around 20 minutes. And after what felt like an eternity of silence and suspense, Tim finally worked up the courage to press on. They pulled out slowly, cautiously, hoping that the red car would finally go on its way. But as soon as they rounded the corner, there it was again. The The red car. Exactly where they left it. Right behind them, maintaining the same distance, going at the same speed. Tim said his stomach dropped. He couldn't believe it. It was like the car was stuck to them. They didn't know what to do. They tried speeding up again, hoping that this time they could outrun it, but it didn't work. No matter how fast Tim went, the car followed. There was no shaking it off. Tim said they were both terrified by this point, not knowing what to think, not sure if they were being chased or just caught in a bad situation. But then they saw something that made the hairs on their necks stand up even more, a fork in the road ahead. One road led back to the college town, familiar, safe. The other went further into the woods, deep into the unknown. Without a word, Tim took the turn toward the town. They didn't even look back. They just went, praying the red car would leave them alone. And then, finally, after what felt like an eternity of unease, Tim saw the red car disappear behind them. They never saw it again. For the rest of their drive, they stayed quiet. Tim said he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, someone who had been following them, watching them. But by the time they pulled into the town and back to safety, it was over. It didn't feel real at the time. I mean, it was a strange story, and even though Steve was adamant that it had happened, I wasn't so sure. It just seemed off. Maybe it was a crazy coincidence. Maybe Tim and his friend were just freaked out by the dark road. Maybe they'd imagined the whole thing. I didn't know. That is, until the news report. It was a couple of years later, around 2008 or 2009, when I was home doing homework, listening to a local talk radio station in Orange County, California. I wasn't paying much attention until I heard a breaking news bulletin. A murder had taken place in a neighboring county the night before, and the only witness had seen a car leaving the scene. The car was described as a red compact vehicle, and its license plate had a black O and a green M. I swear, I nearly froze. My stomach dropped. I couldn't breathe for a second. OM, that was the same license plate Tim had seen. That was the same red car. I couldn't wrap my head around it. What the hell was that car doing here? How could that be possible? I ran into Steve at school the next day, and when I told him about the news report, his face went pale. He'd heard the same report, and he was just as shaken up as I was. And then we learned something. Something that both terrified and confirmed what we had been too scared to admit. OM was real. That wasn't just a freak coincidence. But the story didn't end there. Fast forward to the spring of the next year. My friend Blake was driving home after dropping off his girlfriend around 2 a.m. He took a highway that wound through a canyon on his way back, a quiet, isolated stretch of road. Blake had heard the stories of OM. He knew what could happen if you were unlucky enough to cross paths with that car. As he drove, he noticed something up ahead, a red compact car. He didn't think much of it at first, but then he saw the license plate, black O and green M. Blake didn't hesitate. He slowed down, falling as far behind as the car would let him. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't about to end up like Tim. As they neared the end of the canyon, Blake saw the red car do something strange. It made a U-turn. It turned around and headed back in the opposite direction, leaving Blake to continue on his way home, heart still racing. That was the last Blake ever saw of it. So, what do we know about OM? Not much, except that it was real. It wasn't just some weird coincidence. It wasn't some urban legend. I don't know if OM is a killer, a stalker, or something else entirely. All I know is that the stories are real, and that car, that license plate, OM, it's out there. We had spent the weekend up at the cabins along the Delaware River, a place that had been in my wife's family for generations. The whole family used it at different points throughout the year. Each cabin was tucked away in the woods, making it a great spot for long weekends and family gatherings. The kind of place you'd go to unwind and escape the busyness of the world. It was a late afternoon when things started to go sideways. My wife and I were there with her cousin, John, and his wife, Megan. John and I had always gotten along well. He was the kind of guy you could grab a beer with, talk about the usual stuff, and have a good time. But that day, there was tension in the air. At first, it wasn't anything too obvious. We were all hanging out in the cabin, playing cards and talking about whatever. But as the afternoon wore on, it started to bubble up. John and Megan had been arguing in the kitchen, but at first, I thought it was just one of those minor spats that would blow over. They'd had a few of those over the years, but nothing serious. But as time went on, it became clear that this one wasn't going to fade quickly. John stormed out of the cabin after an hour or so. He didn't say anything to anyone, just grabbed his jacket and left. Megan stayed behind, pacing and looking out the window, watching as her husband walked down the dirt road that ran between the cabins. The tension was thick in the cabin now, and after a few more minutes of awkward silence, Megan turned to me, her eyes wide with worry. "Can you go check on him? Please. It's getting late." I wasn't too thrilled about the idea. At that point, I just wanted to relax, but I agreed. It was starting to get that soft, amber glow of late afternoon, and if John was going for a walk to cool off, he needed to come back before it got dark. I stepped out the door and headed down the road. The dirt path stretched for about a mile, with cabins on either side, all spaced far apart enough that the next nearest neighbor was out of earshot. The trees around us were dense, the leaves still full from summer, casting the whole area in a deep shade. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, the kind of place where you could almost hear your thoughts too loudly. I walked for a while, looking for any sign of John. He was usually an easy guy to spot, tall, wearing a flannel shirt, and he always had this slow, deliberate way of walking that made him stand out in a crowd. But there was nothing, no sign of him anywhere. The dirt road curved at the end and opened up into a nature preserve. There were hiking trails, some well-trodden and others overgrown with wildflowers. I hesitated for a moment, thinking that maybe he'd walked into the woods to get some space. It wasn't like him to go far, but the preserve was right there, so I figured I might as well check. I stepped off the dirt road and walked into the trail, calling out for him every few steps. "John, hey man, where are you?" There was no answer at first, just the rustle of leaves and the faint sound of the river downstream. But then, off in the distance, I heard something. Here. It was so faint I almost thought I imagined it. I stopped walking and called out again, louder this time. "John, where are you, man? Come on, it's getting late." Again, I heard it, here. This time, it was clearer, closer. My mind immediately went to the worst. I figured John must have been hurt somehow, or maybe he just wandered off deeper into the woods in a huff. Either way, the idea of him being alone out there started to get under my skin. I pushed forward, stepping deeper into the woods. The trees here were thick, the canopy blocking out most of the light, leaving only slivers of sun filtering through. The trail wasn't very wide, just a narrow dirt path, but it was well worn, like it had been used many times before. I called again, louder this time. "John, come on, man, you need to come back to the cabin. It's getting dark." And then I heard it again. Here. But this time it was closer. I stopped, trying to process what was happening. The voice had been coming from the same general direction every time, but it felt off. Too easy. Too familiar. I thought about John's anger earlier and how he might be messing with me, trying to get me to follow him into the woods for no good reason. I figured he was probably hiding just out of sight, getting a laugh at my expense. But something about the voice, it wasn't quite right. I kept walking. The farther I went, the more the darkness seemed to press in. The sun was just above the horizon now, and it wouldn't be long before it was completely dark. My stomach started to churn a little, and the feeling of unease I'd had since stepping off the road grew with every step. I called out one last time, maybe out of frustration, maybe because I was starting to lose patience. "John, come back to the cabin. This isn't funny anymore." But then, the voice came again. But this time, it was different. It wasn't the voice I'd heard before, the voice of someone calling from the woods. This time, the voice said something else. "You come here." The words chilled me, and I stopped in my tracks. Something about the way it was said, there was a sharp edge to it, an almost mocking tone. It felt wrong. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something was very wrong. I turned around immediately, my heart pounding in my chest, the sudden urge to get back to the cabin overwhelming. I started walking quickly, then breaking into a jog, then a full-out run as the darkness started to claim the woods around me. I had no idea what had just happened, but the last thing I wanted to do was hang around any longer. My mind raced with the thought of someone, or something, luring me deeper into the woods. I finally broke out of the trees and back onto the dirt road, panting and exhausted, still unsure of what I had just heard, or who had been calling me. The cabin wasn't far, and I could see the light from the windows flickering in the growing dark. When I got back inside, I could tell something was off. My wife and Megan were sitting on the couch, but their faces instantly went pale when they saw me. They had been watching out the window, waiting for me to come back. They must have seen the look of sheer disbelief on my face, because Megan spoke first. What happened? Did you find him? I couldn't even speak at first. I was still trying to make sense of what had just occurred. The voice, the way it had called me, it didn't sit right. I just sat there, trying to catch my breath. I found him, but my voice trailed off. There was something else. Someone was calling me from the woods. Both of their faces froze. Megan looked at my wife, and the room seemed to go quiet. I could feel the weight of the silence. You're sure it was John? Megan asked after a long pause. I don't know, I said. It didn't sound like him. It was too strange, too calm. We sat there for a long while, unsure of what had just happened. It didn't take long for John to show up, strolling back into the cabin as if nothing was wrong. He looked fine, a little flushed from the walk, but he was in no way distressed. He seemed completely unaware of the tension in the air. When he walked in, my wife immediately got up and asked him if he'd been messing with me. John looked confused. What do you mean? I've been walking for hours. I just needed some space. I didn't say anything for a while. The room was heavy with confusion. I kept replaying the voice in my head, trying to piece together what had happened, but it didn't make any sense. I couldn't figure out what or who had been calling me deeper into the woods. It didn't sound like anyone I knew. It didn't matter, though. I'd found John. We were all safe. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been wrong out there, something that couldn't be explained. And to this day, I still don't know what it was, what called me into the woods that night. But I learned one thing. When things feel off, you don't second-guess your instincts. You get the hell out of there. I had worked at the nursing home for about 6 months when the first incident happened. At first, it didn't seem like much, just a casual, if strange, remark from one of the residents. But as time went on, I began to notice a pattern. It was like something was lurking behind the normal routines, something I couldn't explain. It was a regular Tuesday morning, the usual early shift when I arrived, and everything seemed calm. The soft sounds of the morning announcements played over the loudspeakers, and the chatter of other aides and nurses filled the air as they tended to the residents. My mom, who was a charge nurse at the facility for over 13 years, had always warned me about the unpredictability of the job, especially with some of the older residents. Dementia was common, and it had a way of blurring the line between reality and imagination. I started by helping Mrs. Walters, an elderly lady who was usually in good spirits. She'd been here for years, a staple of the nursing home, always laughing and telling stories about her childhood. But today, something was off. When I arrived at her room to help her into her wheelchair, she seemed agitated, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her glasses. "Are you okay, Mrs. Walters?" I asked, concerned by her strange mood. "I can't go on the elevator with you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes darted around the room, and she shook her head, almost like she was trying to convince herself of something. "Not with him there. I'm scared of the little boy." I paused, not sure if I had heard her correctly. "A little boy?" I smiled nervously, trying to dismiss the comment. "There's no little boy here, Mrs. Walters. It's just me." Her gaze grew distant, and she muttered something under her breath, barely audible. "He follows me. He always wants to play." I thought she was just having a moment, maybe a brief episode. I helped her into the chair, not giving the comment much more thought. Nursing homes are full of odd, sometimes unsettling, experiences, especially when dealing with residents who have dementia. But it stuck with me, that strange warning about the little boy. Later that day, I was helping Mr. Thompson, another resident who had been with the facility for a while. He had been mostly quiet lately, a bit withdrawn, but he still had moments of lucidity where he would ask for things like candy or his favorite newspaper. As I passed his room on my rounds, he suddenly appeared in the hallway, standing with his walker, looking at me with wide eyes. "Candy for the little boy," he said, his voice soft but insistent. His hands shook as he reached toward me. I frowned, confused. "Candy for who, Mr. Thompson?" "The little boy," he repeated, his voice lowering to almost a whisper. "He wants candy." I didn't know what to make of it. It was possible that Mr. Thompson was experiencing some confusion, as he often did, but the repetition of the phrase unsettled me. It reminded me too much of Mrs. Walters' strange comment earlier. When I returned to the nurse's station, I decided to ask my mom about it. She had been working in the nursing home for longer than anyone else and had seen her fair share of odd situations. I didn't expect much, but I had to know if anyone else had mentioned anything similar. "What do you think about the little boy?" I asked, not sure how to phrase it. She glanced at me, her expression unreadable for a moment, then sighed heavily. She leaned in a little closer. "You've heard it, haven't you?" I nodded, still feeling a sense of unease settling into my stomach. "All through the years, residents have reported seeing him," she said, her voice low, as if she was sharing a secret. "Some see him more clearly than others, but it's always the same story. A little boy who wants to play. He's always about 8 or 9, never older. And he's been described the same way. Dark black hair, wearing ragged clothes, and always saying he wants to play with them. Is this normal?" I asked, trying to make sense of it. She shrugged. "You'd be surprised what people with dementia see. But here's the thing. This boy, he's not just something the confused ones talk about. Healthy residents, people who are still sharp, they see him too. And it's not just 1 or 2 people. It's been going on for years. Do they say anything about who he is?" I asked, feeling more intrigued than I expected. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "He's always described the same way, no matter where the residents go. Even if they move to a new facility, he follows them. And there's one thing a lot of them have mentioned, especially the ones with limited sight. They say he lives out in a tent, and he told them he died when a tree fell on him. That part's always the same." I felt a chill run down my spine. A little boy who died in a tragic accident, and now he was appearing to residents in this facility. I didn't know what to think about it. It could just be coincidence, or it could be something else entirely. But that night, something happened that changed everything for me. I was feeding Mrs. Daniels, a resident who had recently suffered a stroke. She was still recovering, her right hand no longer functioning, and she needed assistance with almost everything. I was gently spoon-feeding her, making sure she had enough to eat, when I felt a cold hand on my arm. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe the air conditioning was too high or something, but the cold feeling lingered. I turned to look, but there was nothing there. It was then that Mrs. Daniels spoke up. "Is that your boyfriend?" she asked, her voice sweet but clearly teasing. "He looks a little young for you." My heart stopped. I froze, looking around the room. There was no one else in the vicinity, no one nearby. Just me and Mrs. Daniels. I tried to shake it off, laughing nervously. "No, Mrs. Daniels, no boyfriend here." But her eyes had already returned to her meal, as if the comment had been no more than a passing thought. My mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. I couldn't stop thinking about the cold hand on my arm. It wasn't just a strange feeling. It was as if someone had physically touched me. But there was no one there. That night, as I was finishing up my shift, I was told that Mrs. Daniels had passed away. The cause was likely a combination of her stroke complications and the natural progression of her condition. But the timing was eerie. The comment she'd made about the young boyfriend kept ringing in my ears. I didn't tell anyone else about what had happened with the cold hand, not wanting to appear paranoid or irrational. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something more was going on. As the weeks passed, more residents continued to mention the little boy. Some said they'd seen him playing in the hallways late at night. Others described hearing his laughter echoing through the building. And every time someone spoke of him, the descriptions were eerily consistent. Dark black hair, a sad little boy who wanted to play. But no one seemed to have any answers. The boy didn't seem to harm anyone, but his presence was unsettling. It was as though he was always watching, always waiting for someone to notice him. I couldn't help but wonder if he was somehow tied to the resident's passing. Was it a coincidence that those who saw him were the ones who seemed to pass away shortly after? I couldn't answer that. All I knew was that my time at the nursing home was never quite the same after that night with Mrs. Daniels. To this day, I still don't know what I believe. Was the little boy just a product of the residents' imaginations, or was there something more to it? Maybe it was all coincidence. Maybe it wasn't. But one thing is for certain. I'll never forget the cold hand on my arm, the teasing remark from Mrs. Daniels, and the unsettling presence that seemed to follow us all through that building. Something was there, and I'll never forget it. It was about 6 years ago when I was 19. I had been living in a small town, still figuring things out, doing what most 19-year-olds do. Hang out with friends, watch movies, and try to avoid any real responsibilities. At the time, I had 2 best friends who were closer than family. We'd been inseparable since childhood, and we did everything together. So, one weekend, I decided to crash at their place for the night. Their house was an old two-story building, located just on the edge of town. It was a little rundown, but in that cozy, lived-in kind of way. The creaky floors, the dim light from the hallway, and the faded curtains made it feel a bit eerie even in the daylight, but I didn't think much of it. It had always been like this. We would spend hours watching movies, playing games, and joking around. At the end of the night, we all piled into one of the rooms to sleep. The three of us had made a habit of sleeping on the bed together whenever we stayed over. It felt safer somehow, or at least more comfortable than sleeping alone in that large, empty house. That night, I remember it vividly. I fell asleep easily enough. The kind of deep, exhausted sleep that comes after a long day of hanging out. But then, in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. No particular reason. No sound, no movement, just the abruptness of it. I could see the faint light of the moon coming through the curtains, and the room was quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of silence that makes you feel like something's off. As I shifted my position, something caught my eye. At the foot of the bed, standing just a few feet away from us, was a little girl. She was maybe 6 or 7 years old, with long, dark hair and a plain white dress that looked out of place in the dim light. She was standing perfectly still, staring directly at us, her eyes wide open. Her gaze was fixed, but it wasn't the curiosity of a child. It was something else, something unsettling, like she wasn't supposed to be there. I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't blink. I just stared back at her, my mind racing. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing, but there was no denying it. I wasn't dreaming, I was wide awake, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to scream, but the words stuck in my throat. I was too scared to move or make a sound, too scared to even wake my friends. She didn't say anything, didn't make any sound. She just stood there, watching us. The room seemed colder, and the silence grew heavier, suffocating. I tried to convince myself that I was just seeing things, that it was a trick of the light, or that maybe I was half awake and dreaming. But no, this felt too real. The girl didn't flicker like a dream. She was solid, real, and she was there, staring at me. As I continued to stare at her, she slowly began to fade. It wasn't like she just disappeared in a blink of an eye. No, it was more like she was being swallowed by the darkness. Her figure just became more and more faint, like she was dissolving into the shadows. The last thing I saw was her eyes, still locked onto mine, and then she was gone. The room was empty, just like it had been before I woke up. My heart was still pounding, and I was drenched in cold sweat, but there was nothing there now. No girl, no strange presence, just silence. I laid there for what felt like forever, too scared to move, too scared to close my eyes. My mind kept racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was I imagining it? Had I dreamed it? Could it have been some sort of half-sleep hallucination? But no, the memory was too clear, too vivid. I could still see the girl's face, her blank stare, her old-fashioned dress. I couldn't explain it. I didn't tell my friends about what had happened right away. I convinced myself that it was just some weird dream or a trick of my half-awake mind. But I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that stayed with me the rest of the night. I didn't sleep well, and when I finally did drift off, it was with one eye open, scanning the room for any sign of that little girl. A couple of months passed, and I still couldn't get the image of her out of my head. I didn't tell my friends because I honestly didn't believe it myself. I thought if I said something, they'd think I was losing it. Who would believe me? Who would understand how real it felt? Then, a few months later, something happened that made me reconsider everything. One evening, my two friends and I were sitting around, talking about weird stuff that had happened to us in the past. We were telling ghost stories, sharing odd experiences, and joking around, as we usually did. At some point, they started talking about something that had happened to them not long ago, and it made my stomach drop. They told me that one night, they were in their room, just hanging out, when they heard the sound of children laughing coming from the living room. They were both confused at first, thinking maybe they had heard something on TV or from outside. But no, the laughter was coming from inside the house, and it was loud, echoing through the hallways. They looked at each other, wondering what the heck was going on. Curious, they went to the door and listened closer. The laughter stopped suddenly, and then there was a loud, jarring thunk on the door. It sounded like someone had slammed their fist against it. They jumped back, startled, and quickly opened the door to check the house. But when they looked around, there was no one there. No one in the living room, no one in the hallway. All the doors were still locked. and everything seemed just like it had been before. They checked the whole house, but there was no sign of anyone. No explanation for the laughter or the strange noise. They were completely freaked out, and I could see it in their eyes as they told me. They were as shaken as I had been after my own experience. I hadn't even mentioned what happened to me yet, but as soon as they finished telling their story, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I told them about the little girl I had seen that night, the way she had stood at the foot of the bed, staring at us, and how she had faded away. I told them how real it felt, how scared I had been. They were silent for a moment, and I could see them processing it, trying to make sense of it all. We didn't have any answers. We didn't know what to think. But the coincidence was too strange to ignore. Something had been happening in that house. It wasn't just one of us. It wasn't just a bad dream. Something had been there with us, something we couldn't explain. In the weeks that followed, we talked more about what had happened, trying to make sense of it. We didn't jump to conclusions or call it a ghost. We didn't want to label it as something paranormal, but we couldn't deny that something had been off. Maybe it was a trick of the mind. Maybe there was some logical explanation we hadn't figured out yet. But the unease lingered, and it stayed with us. The strange things didn't happen again, at least not to the same degree. But we couldn't shake the feeling that we'd been touched by something that night. Something that, to this day, I can't fully explain. I still wonder if it was all just a product of an overactive imagination, or if something truly strange happened in that house that night. But regardless, it's a memory I'll never forget. I never went back to that house after that. My friends and I stayed in touch, but that place had an unsettling energy we couldn't shake. Whatever had happened there, it was real, at least to us. And maybe in the end, that's all that matters. Many strange and unsettling things have happened to me and my family over the years, but one event in particular has always managed to stand out in my mind, making my palms sweat and my eyes tear up with fear whenever I think about it. This story, as terrifying as it is, belongs to my aunt, a woman known for her rational thinking, her scientific mindset, and her love for nature. She's a retired middle school science teacher who spent decades inspiring young minds with her knowledge of botany, geology, and archaeology. Her passion for learning and exploring the world never waned, and during her years as a teacher, she would often take part in summer workshops, educational programs designed to immerse teachers in new scientific experiences. These workshops were meant to enhance their knowledge and help them bring fresh insights back to their students. One summer, my aunt participated in a workshop set in the vast and barren landscapes of New Mexico. The program, part of a professional development initiative for science teachers, was focused on the desert ecosystems, the unique flora and fauna, and the mysteries that the southwestern landscape held. It was a week-long expedition, with each day packed with field studies, hands-on experiments, and lectures from experts in the field. My aunt was excited to immerse herself in the environment she had read about in textbooks and studied through photos. For her, it was an opportunity to deepen her understanding of the natural world, and she couldn't wait to get started. The group of teachers she was with was composed of like-minded individuals, all eager to learn and share their experiences. The days were long, filled with hikes across the desert, examining rock formations, identifying rare plants, and studying the ancient geologic history that shaped the land. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, they were all exhausted, physically and mentally drained from the intense days of exploration. However, the excitement of discovery kept everyone in high spirits as they made their way back to their hotel each night. On one particular evening, after an especially grueling day of field studies, my aunt and her group were headed back to their hotel, which was near Roswell, New Mexico. It was around midnight, and although they were all tired and looking forward to a good night's sleep, the hotel wasn't far from their site. Given how close it was, they didn't feel the need to use a map, and the thought of GPS didn't even cross their minds, as it wasn't a common thing back then. They had driven the route earlier in the day, so they were confident in their ability to find their way back, despite the late hour. The road they were traveling on was an isolated stretch of highway, winding through the flat and desolate desert landscape. The headlights of their vehicles illuminated the barren surroundings, casting long shadows that stretched across the asphalt. My aunt recalls the quiet hum of the tires on the road, the occasional gust of wind ruffling the dry desert brush on either side of the highway. It was peaceful in a way, but the silence was also a little eerie, like the land itself was holding its breath. As they passed a dilapidated convenience store on the side of the road, my aunt and her group recognized it. They had seen it earlier in the day when they were on their way to the field site. The store looked like something straight out of an old Western movie, weathered and worn down by time, with a flickering neon sign that buzzed intermittently. It was an odd little place, surrounded by nothing but miles of open desert. But the group didn't think much of it. They were just ready to get to their hotel. At the next intersection, they came to a four-way stop. Without thinking, they took the same route they had driven earlier that day, straight ahead. The drive seemed straightforward enough, and they all assumed they were heading in the right direction. But as they continued down the road, something began to feel off. It was subtle at first, a nagging sense that something wasn't quite right. My aunt couldn't put her finger on it, but the feeling grew with each passing minute. After about 10 minutes, they passed the same convenience store once again. The flickering neon sign caught their attention, and they all exchanged puzzled looks. They had just passed it, hadn't they? It didn't make sense. It couldn't have been that far from the stop sign, and yet, here they were again, driving past it as though they had turned around and gone back in time. A few chuckles passed between the group, but there was an undercurrent of uncertainty in the air. Maybe they were all just overtired, or the road was playing tricks on them. It was late, and they had been driving for hours, so they didn't think much more of it. But as they kept going, the feeling of unease only intensified. 10 minutes later, they passed the store again. This time, the unease started to turn into something darker, something they couldn't ignore. The same rickety building, the same glowing sign in the distance. How could they have passed it again? There was no way they could have turned around without noticing it. The store was still on their right, just as it had been the first 2 times. The group's laughter faded, replaced by a growing sense of confusion. They couldn't have taken the wrong turn. They were all certain they had stayed on the same road the entire time. One of the teachers in the car, a woman named Carla, suggested they take the next turn and try a different route. So they did. The car turned right at the next intersection, confident that this would finally get them back on track. But as they continued down this new road, the store loomed ahead once more. There it was on the left, flickering just as it had before. The headlights illuminated its grimy windows, casting an eerie glow across the desert. It was impossible. This couldn't be happening. Now anxiety was creeping in. My aunt felt her heart rate quicken as she looked at her fellow teachers, all of them now wide-eyed and speechless. They had taken a turn, for heaven's sake. How could they be seeing the same store again and again? The group was silent, each of them staring out their windows at the store as if it were some kind of bizarre optical illusion. But it wasn't an illusion. They had all seen it. With a sense of desperation now hanging in the air, they made another turn at the next stop sign. Left this time. Surely, this would lead them in the right direction. But as they made their way down the new road, they passed the store once again. There it was, standing in the distance, like a mirage, waiting to mock them. This time, no one laughed. No one even spoke. The silence in the car was suffocating. Every one of them had the same thought running through their minds. This was not possible. They were stuck in some kind of strange loop, circling back to the same place over and over again, no matter which way they turned. By this point, my aunt was no longer sure if the store was real. Was it even there at all? It felt like they were being trapped in a never-ending cycle, and each time they passed the store, it seemed to get more sinister. The once simple structure now seemed to loom over them, its lights flickering ominously in the night. Each time they passed it, it felt like the store was closing in on them, a symbol of some unseen force that was controlling the very roads they drove on. The heat of the desert night pressed in on them, and a sense of helplessness washed over my aunt. It felt like time was warping, like reality itself was slipping away. The group was no longer joking or laughing. They were frightened, and my aunt could feel the tension thickening in the air. After what felt like hours, they finally managed to drive far enough to get away from the store, but the drive back to the hotel was still long. My aunt has never been able to fully explain what happened that night. Was it some kind of optical illusion? A trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion? Or was there something else at play? They eventually made it back to the hotel, their minds reeling from the strange experience. As they parked the car, my aunt couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that something beyond her comprehension had occurred. The group said little as they filed into the hotel, each of them likely reflecting on what had just happened. To this day, my aunt swears that what they experienced was real. She can still feel the strange tension in the air, the confusion, the growing dread as they kept passing that same store over and over again. It wasn't an illusion or a mistake. Something about that night felt off, like they had crossed into another dimension, or maybe they had simply stumbled upon something they couldn't understand. It still makes my heart race thinking about it. Maybe it was the exhaustion, maybe it was something else. Whatever it was one of those moments that leaves you with more questions than answers, a moment that you can't shake, no matter how much time passes. But I do know one thing, whatever happened that night, my aunt will never forget it, and neither will I. It's funny how your bedroom can feel like the safest place on earth when you're younger, but when you grow up, you start to feel a bit less secure. My room was fairly standard for a teenager, nothing too out of the ordinary. The walls were decorated with posters, a mix of bands, movies, and random things I thought were cool at the time. But there was one part of my room that never seemed to sit right with me, and that was the alcove. It sat across the room from my bed, right next to the closet. The closet's placement in the room meant that the alcove stayed in near total darkness at night. There was no light from the ceiling, and the street lights outside didn't reach that far. It was just a dark, cold corner. I used to think nothing of it, but that was before the nights started to feel different. Before I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me from that corner. It was the middle of the week, and I was in my 4th year of high school. Like most teenagers, I was starting to feel a little worn out. I had been staying up late studying for a test, and when I finally decided to go to bed, I was already drained. My bed, my sanctuary for the night, had never felt more inviting. But sleep wasn't coming easily that night. At first, it was just the usual restlessness. My mind kept racing, thoughts tumbling over each other. But then it turned into something else, a feeling. You know the one, when it's like someone is watching you, even though you're alone? It was that, but far more intense. It felt like something was staring at me from the corner of my room. And it wasn't just any kind of stare. It was malevolent. The kind of gaze that made your skin crawl and your heart race. I tried to push it out of my mind. It's just your imagination. You're just tired. It's nothing, I kept telling myself. I closed my eyes, trying to focus on the sound of my breathing, hoping that if I just willed myself to sleep, the feeling would go away. But it didn't. I opened my eyes, and the first thing my gaze was drawn to was that dark alcove, the one place in the room where the light never seemed to reach. It had always been a place I avoided looking at, even when I was younger, but tonight it felt different. I squinted into the darkness, trying to make out what might be there, but all I saw was a vague, darker outline, something that didn't belong. My heart thumped in my chest, and goosebumps prickled along my arms. I told myself it was just the shadows playing tricks on me, that it was just my tired mind creating something out of nothing. But that feeling, that evil stare didn't go away. I turned my head away, shutting my eyes tightly, trying to force my mind to quiet down. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that there was no reason to be afraid of some shadow in the corner. I pulled the blanket up to my chin and willed myself to fall asleep. But then, just as I started to drift off, I felt it again, the weight of something watching me. I opened my eyes. This time, the shadow wasn't just in the corner. It was right beside my bed. The dark figure, bent over me, leaning close, its outline unmistakable in the dim light of my room. The same sinister presence I had felt earlier was now real, tangible. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, my body stiff with fear. My mind raced, and my heart pounded in my chest, louder than ever. The figure was so close now, I could almost feel the coldness radiating from it. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The figure was tall, and its presence felt suffocating, like it was somehow pressing down on the entire room. The air was thick with an unspoken threat. My body wanted to move, to get up and run, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to even scream. And then the breathing started. It wasn't normal breathing. It wasn't the sound of someone exhaling, like a person would. No, it was deeper, heavier. It came from somewhere far too close, as though whatever was standing there was right next to me, breathing over me. It felt like something from a nightmare, but it was real. I could hear it. I could feel it. Every instinct I had told me to run, to get up, to scream, to do something, anything, but I was frozen. I couldn't do a thing. My mind was in a complete panic, but my body refused to respond. I didn't want to look, didn't want to acknowledge what I was seeing, but somehow I did. I don't know how much time passed, but it felt like forever. The air was still thick with dread, the figure hanging there in the dark. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could barely hear anything over the sound of my own breath. I closed my eyes again, trying to block it out, but I could still feel the presence. In a sudden surge of panic, I threw the pillow over my head, pulling the blanket tightly around me. I buried myself in the fabric, hoping that if I could just hide under it, whatever was there would leave. I squeezed my eyes shut, tears gathering at the corners of my eyes. I don't know how long I cried there, too terrified to move, too terrified to even think. Finally, exhaustion won out. I fell asleep, still shaking and fearful, but I couldn't keep my eyes open any longer. The next morning, I woke up in a fog. The memories of the night before were still fresh, but I wasn't sure if they were real or if I had just dreamed them. I tried to brush it off, thinking it had all been a nightmare. After all, it didn't make sense. There was no way that shadow could have been real, right? But the unsettling feeling didn't go away. Over the next few days, the sense that something was off only intensified. I didn't want to be in my room at night. I avoided that corner, that alcove, where the darkness felt so thick, like it was waiting for something to happen. But it wasn't just the corner that bothered me. It was the sounds. I heard things. Doors slamming shut without anyone upstairs. No wind, no draft. It was as if the doors just slammed, violently and without warning. And it wasn't just once, it was constant. My parents thought I was imagining things. Maybe I was just tired from studying. But I knew what I heard. I could tell the difference between an old house creaking and the unmistakable sound of a door slamming shut. And it wasn't just the doors. Sometimes at night, I would hear noises from upstairs, footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps, like someone was walking through the house when no one should have been. I would lie in my bed, wide-eyed, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But the sense of dread never left. It was always there, lingering. I don't know what happened that night, or why it felt so real. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it was something else, something that wasn't meant to be there. But whatever it was, it left a mark. I stopped sleeping soundly, always half waiting for something to happen, for the door to slam, for the figure to return. I never quite felt safe in my room again. And to this day, I don't know what it was. But I know one thing for sure. Whatever it was, it didn't want me there. And that's a feeling you don't forget. The night started like any other, or so I thought. I was in Toronto for a concert, a big one, and the crowd was buzzing with energy. I'd been drinking for hours before I even stepped into the venue. My friends and I were all hyped up, laughing and taking shots, trying to keep pace with the beats. We were all about having a good time. I didn't think much of it when we got separated during the concert. It wasn't unusual for us to lose track of each other in a crowd that size. I guess I wandered off and got a bit too caught up in my own world, though, because the next thing I remember, I was outside, standing on a sidewalk. It was late. I mean real late. The kind of late when most people are heading home. But I wasn't worried about that. I was drunk, yes, but I was used to it. It's not like it was the first time I'd gotten into a situation like this. I fumbled for my phone, realized I'd lost my wallet somewhere, but didn't let that ruin my buzz. I figured I'd deal with it later. Then I saw the lights, blue and red flashing in the distance. I didn't think anything of it at first. There was a lot of commotion going on around me, but then it hit me. The unmarked car pulled up beside me, and I thought, okay, that's weird. I'd seen unmarked cars before, but they were usually just regular cops doing their thing. Before I could even gather my thoughts, a couple of guys stepped out of the car and walked toward me. They didn't seem like regular cops. For one, they were dressed in plain clothes, not uniforms. The whole thing felt off from the start. They said something about me being drunk in public, and that I was going to be arrested. I barely registered what they were saying. Honestly, I didn't care. I was in no shape to argue. So, I stumbled into the back of their car and passed out almost immediately. When I woke up, I was confused. My head was spinning, and my mouth felt like sandpaper. I had no idea how long I'd been out, but I knew I wasn't in the same place anymore. The car had stopped, and the door was opening. The guy who was in the front seat, one of the officers, or whatever they were, said something, but I didn't catch it. They pulled me out of the car, and I could barely stand, swaying like a drunk leaf in the wind. The building I was in front of didn't look like a police station. It was massive, but it didn't have the usual features of a station. No sirens, no big signs, no anything that screamed law enforcement. It looked like a warehouse, just a big industrial building. The kind of place that had probably been around for decades, its metal walls rusting in places. They took me inside. I was disoriented, but I was still drunk, so I didn't really put up a fight. They led me down a long hallway, and then I was in what looked like a hospital room. I figured maybe they were taking me to a holding cell, but something felt strange about the whole situation. It didn't smell like a police station. It had that sterile medical scent that reminded me of a hospital. The whole place felt clinical, even though I couldn't quite place why. A group of people came over to me. They were wearing what looked like nurse uniforms, but I couldn't focus enough to make sense of anything. One of them grabbed my arm and immediately started taking blood, more than I would have expected. It didn't register at first. Maybe I was too drunk to care, or maybe it just seemed normal. But I was definitely getting more blood taken than usual. They kept poking and prodding at me, and I started feeling lightheaded. I tried to protest, but the words didn't come out right. I could barely keep my eyes open. Then, they led me into a small room. It was dark, and I could barely see what was going on. My legs felt weak, and my head was throbbing, but I followed them like a zombie. At this point, I was barely holding on to any semblance of reality. I didn't care anymore. But then things took a turn for the worse. One of the people in the room, who looked like a big bouncer, shoved me onto a bed. He wasn't gentle. He didn't say anything, just slammed me down and strapped me to the bed. There were these thick leather straps across my chest, arms, legs, and waist. At least 7 or 8 straps, all tight, pinning me down. I couldn't move. I couldn't get up. I started freaking out, struggling against the straps, but it was no use. I couldn't breathe properly, couldn't calm down. I felt trapped. The room was pitch black, and I couldn't see anything. The only sound was my own frantic breathing and the pulse of my heart pounding in my ears. I don't know how long I struggled like that. Time seemed to stretch on forever. I could hear voices outside the room, but I couldn't make sense of them. The feeling of being completely restrained was enough to send my mind spiraling. The room was cold, and I could feel the sweat collecting on my skin. I didn't know if I was going to suffocate or just pass out from exhaustion, but eventually I did. My body gave out. I drifted into unconsciousness. When I woke up, it was like nothing had changed. My mind was fuzzy, but I could hear birds chirping nearby. I blinked, confused. The light was harsh, sunlight streaming down from above. I was lying in some bushes, next to a Burger King. How had I gotten there? I didn't know. My head was pounding from a headache that seemed like it was trying to split my skull open. My body ached, and I felt disoriented. I checked myself, wallet still in my pocket, phone still there, and $15 in my wallet. I couldn't make sense of it. I had no idea how I ended up outside, in the bushes, next to a fast food joint. I stood up, unsteady on my feet, and looked around. Nothing made sense. The whole situation was surreal. Had I been drugged? That was the first thing that crossed my mind. My friends thought so when I told them what happened, but I wasn't sure. It didn't feel like it. It felt real, but how could it be real? I called one of my friends, told them I was in Toronto, near the Burger King, and I had no idea how I got there. They came to pick me up. They didn't have any answers either. We were all just trying to make sense of what had happened, but none of us could. It didn't add up. I never got a clear answer. No one knew where I'd been. No one could explain what happened. The only thing that made sense was that I woke up there, and I had no memory of getting there. I still don't know if I was drugged, if it was some kind of weird police prank, or something else entirely. But whatever it was, it still messes with my head to this day. I never went back to that area again. Maybe I was just too scared of what might happen next time. I don't know. To this day, the whole experience still feels like a fog. I don't know if I'll ever get the answers I need. But that night, those few hours, will always remain one of the strangest, most unsettling experiences of my life. I didn't believe in any of it. Not spirits, not demons, not anything beyond what I could see with my own eyes. But there are nights that stay with you for the rest of your life. Nights that make you question everything. This was one of those nights. I was a teenager, maybe 15 or 16, when it happened. It was just a regular sleepover at my friend's house, the kind of thing we'd done 100 times before. Her parents were home, watching TV in the other room, so we had the living room to ourselves. There were 4 of us, sprawled out on the carpet, giggling and snacking, just enjoying the night. The lights were warm, the TV murmured in the background, and the scent of popcorn lingered in the air. We had played cards, then some board games, and at some point, my friend pulled a box out from under the couch. I didn't think much of it at first. It was just another game, or so I thought. The box was old, the cardboard faded and peeling at the edges. I didn't recognize the name. I had never played it before, and honestly, I wasn't even paying that much attention. Someone opened it, unfolded the board, and set out the small planchette. It wasn't until I saw the letters and numbers printed across the board that something in me hesitated. "Wait," I remember saying. "What is this?" The answer came with a casual laugh. A Ouija board. I had heard the name before, but I didn't know much about it. Just that it was something people used to talk to ghosts or something like that. I wasn't into that kind of thing, but I also wasn't about to be the only one who refused to play. It was just a game. That's what I told myself. The others placed their fingers lightly on the planchette, so I did too. Someone started asking questions. It started out harmless enough. "Is there anyone here? Can you talk to us?" At first, nothing happened. The planchette just sat there, motionless. Then, after a few minutes, it moved. Not much, just a slow, deliberate slide across the board. My first thought was that someone was pushing it. I looked up, expecting to see someone smirking, but everyone had the same wide-eyed look I did. The questions got bolder. Someone asked, "Who are you?" The planchette moved again, this time faster. It spun in circles across the board before landing on the letter D. Then E, then V, then I, then Ed. We all froze. I felt something deep in my chest, something cold and heavy. It wasn't fear exactly, at least not yet. More like a shift in the air, like the room itself had taken a breath and was holding it. No one said anything for a moment, then someone whispered, "It's just a joke." But no one was laughing. Then someone said something they shouldn't have. Someone asked it to prove it, and the lights went out. Every single light in the house, lamps, overheads, the glow from the kitchen, even the flickering blue light from the TV, just snapped off at the same time. And then, just as suddenly, they came back on. The silence in the room was suffocating. No one moved. I could hear my own breathing, too fast, too shallow. Someone whispered, "That was weird. We should have stopped then. We should have put the game away and never touched it again." But we didn't. Someone, I don't even remember who, asked one more question. A challenge. "If you're really here, show yourself." At first, nothing happened. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. The TV had turned off again, but the screen wasn't completely black. It had that faint, ghostly reflection of the room in front of it. And in that reflection, asterisk asterisk, there was something sitting with us asterisk asterisk. It wasn't one of us. It wasn't even shaped like a person, not exactly. It was hunched, its limbs long and wrong. It was sitting right there, just a few feet away, and we could all see it. No one screamed. No one moved. The temperature in the room dropped in an instant. I felt it in my bones, an unnatural, biting cold. My hands shook, my breath came out in short, misty puffs. Then the kitchen exploded into noise. Cupboards slammed open and shut, dishes rattled, something heavy crashed to the floor. It was as if an invisible force was tearing the place apart. We scrambled back from the board, knocking over snacks, bumping into each other in our blind panic. Someone grabbed the board, shoved it into the box, and threw it into the trash. I remember my friend's mom bursting into the room, demanding to know what was going on. But we couldn't even speak. That night, I barely slept. I lay there, my heart pounding, staring at the ceiling. It was quiet now, but the cold hadn't left me. It felt like it had sunk into my skin, like I'd never be warm again. At some point, in the dead of night, I heard it. A noise above me. It sounded like something heavy moving across the roof. A slow, dragging sound, mixed with a metallic clinking. Chains. I held my breath, listening, willing it to be my imagination. But it wasn't. Then came the sound of dogs. Not barking, not growling, just moving, pacing, scraping their claws against the shingles, right above where I lay. I wanted to wake someone up, but I was too scared to move. So I lay there, stiff and silent, until the first light of dawn crept through the window. The next morning, I asked my friend's parents about it. I asked if any of the neighbors had dogs. They just gave me a strange look and said, "No, no one around here has dogs." Then they told me something that made my stomach drop. They had heard it too. That was the last time I ever touched a Ouija board. The last time I ever played that game. I don't know what we saw that night. I don't know what was in that house with us. But I know one thing for certain. It was real. And I will never, ever invite it back in. I was 12 years old, fresh off the plane from the United States, trying to adjust to my new life in Querétaro, Mexico. It was a strange and uncomfortable change for me. Everything was so different: the language, the food, the people. It was overwhelming. My parents, my brother, and I had just moved into my grandmother's house for a couple of years because we didn't have anywhere else to stay. My grandma's house was in a rough neighborhood with peeling paint on the walls and cracked sidewalks that lined the streets. I didn't know anyone there, and I often found myself feeling like an outsider. My mom, worried about the safety of the area, would park the car in a guarded parking lot about 2 blocks away from the house. The car couldn't be parked in front of the house, so every morning we'd wake up early, around 5 a.m., and walk those 2 blocks to retrieve it. The streets were quiet at that time of day, mostly empty except for the odd stray dog or someone making their way to work. It wasn't the safest place to be walking around, especially that early, but we had no other choice. And it became part of the routine. One morning, as we walked toward the parking lot, something strange happened. My mom suddenly stopped, her face going pale. I didn't understand why at first, but she grabbed my arm and pulled me to a stop beside her, signaling me to be quiet. My heart started racing. "What's wrong?" I whispered, but she just shushed me, pointing towards the tree ahead. At first, I didn't see anything, just a few bushes and a tree standing there in the dim light. The early morning mist was still hanging in the air, and the street lights above cast long shadows across the ground. Then I saw it. There, peeking out from behind the tree, was a figure. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even close to looking like a person. It was small, maybe around the size of a child, with an odd, grayish skin tone. Its head was large, much too big for its body, and its eyes were massive, dark and unblinking. They weren't human eyes. They had that unsettling, almost black look to them, like they could see into you. For a second, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then it moved. It popped its head out from behind the tree slowly, almost teasingly, like a little kid playing a game of hide and seek. But there was no way this was a kid. It had pointy ears, like some creature out of a story. The figure watched us for what felt like an eternity. There was a chill in the air, a stillness that was too quiet for that time of the morning. My mom didn't say anything, but I could feel her grip tightening on my arm, pulling me away from the sight. She didn't speak a word, just moved quickly, guiding me down a different path, away from the tree. But I didn't stop looking. Even as we turned around, I caught one last glimpse of the creature. It wasn't standing anymore. It was running, faster than anything I've ever seen. The way it darted through the bushes, its movements sharp and erratic, was like it wasn't even touching the ground. The sight of it made my blood run cold. My mom kept walking, pulling me along, never looking back. We made it to the parking lot, and I was too shaken to say anything. The whole walk to the car felt like a blur, and I was too scared to ask my mom what had happened. We didn't talk about it that morning. It wasn't until years later, when I was doing some research on strange sightings and unexplained occurrences, that I came across something that made my heart race again. I was around 15 or 16 at the time. One evening, I stumbled upon a series of articles and testimonies online about encounters with alien-like beings, or greys, as they were called. The descriptions were so close to what I had seen that I froze, my mind flashing back to that morning years ago. They described small, gray creatures with large eyes and pointy ears, exactly like what I had witnessed. I know what you might be thinking. There are always stories like that. People read into things, especially when they're scared. But it didn't feel like that. I couldn't shake the feeling that what I saw that morning was real. The research made it even more real. It wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It wasn't just a trick of the light or some animal I misidentified. I had seen something that didn't belong in our world. I've tried to forget about it. I've tried to tell myself it was just a strange experience, nothing more. But it's hard. I can still picture that figure in my mind, those dark eyes, that unsettling silence as it watched us. The fear I felt when it ran away, moving in a way that didn't make sense. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen. Not then, not now. The whole thing left me questioning what else is out there. I mean, How can you go through something like that and not wonder if we're really alone in the universe? What if there's something else out there, watching us, studying us, or maybe even trying to make contact? The thought is enough to make you second-guess everything you think you know. And to this day, I can't help but wonder if that thing is still out there somewhere waiting. Sometimes, late at night, I think back to that morning and try to understand it. Was it a dream? Maybe. But deep down, I know what I saw. I know it wasn't a mistake, and it wasn't a hallucination. It was real. And every time I try to ignore it, I find myself back at that moment. The one where I saw something that made my blood run cold, something that shouldn't exist. Maybe it was just a strange encounter, or maybe it was something more. I don't know, but I can swear on my life that what I saw was real, and I'll never forget it. I woke up to a dull ache in my head, the kind of hangover that made everything feel slow and muffled, like I was underwater. The room was dim, the blinds half closed, and the air was thick with the lingering smell of last night's drinks and perfume. My mouth was dry. My stomach felt unsettled. I was at my girlfriend's place, sprawled out in her bed, still in nothing but my boxers. It wasn't unusual for me to crash at her place, especially after a night out. The house was quiet except for the occasional hum of cars passing outside. I figured her roommates were at class already. She and her cousin shared this place, a decent little rental with cheap furniture and a lived-in messiness. It wasn't a bad spot, just a regular college house, cluttered coffee tables, half-empty water bottles, and a weird smell from the garbage if no one took it out. I had no plans of getting up anytime soon. The bed was warm, and I was still too groggy to do anything other than lie there. But then, the dogs started freaking out. It wasn't just barking, it was full-on panicked yelping. At first, I tried to ignore it, pressing my forearm over my eyes. Those little dogs were always yapping at something. The Pomeranian belonged to my girlfriend, and her cousin had a Chihuahua. Tiny, energetic little things. Annoying but harmless. Normally, they barked at the mailman or random noises outside, but this was different. It wasn't the usual high-pitched, excited barking. It was frantic. My body tensed before my mind could catch up. I forced myself upright, rubbing my face, listening. The yelps didn't stop. If anything, they got worse, shrill and desperate. Something was wrong. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, still in nothing but my boxers, and stood up. My head pounded as I walked across the room to the door. When I pulled it open, the sight in the hallway made me freeze. Two men, hunched over, holding the dogs down. They weren't messing around either. Both had their hands clamped over the dogs' mouths, shoving them down against the floor. The Pomeranian writhed, its little paws scratching at the tile, eyes bulging in panic. The Chihuahua trembled violently under the grip of the second guy. For half a second, my brain refused to process what I was looking at. It didn't make sense. Maybe they were friends of her cousin? Maybe I had slept through someone coming in? I blinked. No, these weren't friends. Both of them were dressed in baggy hoodies, one wearing a hat low over his eyes, the other with his hood pulled up. They weren't supposed to be here. My body moved before I even had time to think about it. I took a step forward and said, "What's up?" It came out sharp, almost a growl, and even I was surprised by how aggressive I sounded. My voice cut through the house like a slap. The moment the words left my mouth, everything shifted. The guy on the left snapped his head toward me. His eyes widened for a split second before pure instinct kicked in. He shoved the Pomeranian aside and took off. The other guy hesitated for half a breath, then did the same, pushing himself up and sprinting after him. I didn't move. I just stood there, my breath shallow, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. My brain was still trying to catch up, still trying to make sense of what had just happened. Burglars. That's what they were. That realization made my stomach drop. I took a step back into the bedroom and shut the door, flipping the lock without even thinking about it. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my throat. I went straight to the window, peeking through the blinds. The backyard was empty except for the Pomeranian, who was trotting around in circles, confused and still panicked. The guys were gone. No sign of them anywhere. I stayed there for a long moment, just breathing. My pulse was erratic, my hands clammy. Then, after what felt like forever, I forced myself to move. I opened the door again, stepping cautiously into the hallway. It was silent now, the house still in that eerie way that made it feel abandoned. The front door was wide open, swinging slightly from where they must have bolted through it. I checked every room, heart pounding, listening for anything, footsteps, breathing, movement. Nothing. They were gone. Only when I was sure the house was empty did I go back outside. The neighbors had the Pomeranian. Someone had scooped it up, probably confused by the whole thing. I took it from them, mumbling a thank you, and brought it back inside. The Chihuahua, though, nowhere to be seen. I looked around, scanned the streets, checked the backyard again. Nothing. It wasn't until later that evening, when my girlfriend's cousin and her boyfriend went out searching, that they finally found it. Shaken but unharmed, hiding under a bush down the street. That night, lying back in that same bed, I couldn't sleep. Every sound made me tense. Every creak of the house sent a rush of adrenaline through me. The burglars had been inside. Inside. They had been there, feet away from me while I slept. If the dogs hadn't freaked out, if I hadn't gotten up, how long would they have stayed? Would I have woken up to them standing over me? Would they have done something worse? I didn't know. I didn't want to think about it. All I knew was that I wasn't sleeping over there again. When I was younger, we lived in an apartment complex where my mother worked as the manager. It wasn't the nicest place, more rundown than anything, but it had its perks. For one, we always had a roof over our heads, and we didn't have to worry about rent. That made things easier for us, especially after my father left. My mom was a tough woman. She worked long hours and did everything she could to keep things together. I remember it was the day before Halloween. The apartment complex felt quieter than usual, the air heavy with the anticipation of the holiday. My mother had gathered us all together in the common room, and she started telling us a story, one she said she had heard when she first started managing the building. It was about an incident that had occurred in the apartment directly above ours, in a now vacant unit. According to her, a woman had lived there with her 2 children. They had died in a terrible accident, something about a gas leak or fire. I can't quite remember. My mother described it in such detail that I could almost see it happening in my mind, the image of a mother and her 2 sons trapped in that apartment. She went on to say that ever since, people had claimed to hear the sounds of footsteps, light, quick steps, running up and down the hallway late at night, especially near Halloween. We were all sitting there, listening intently, the dark evening pressing in around us. The air seemed to chill, even though the heat was on. My mother's voice dropped a little, as if she was getting lost in the memory of it all. That's when we heard it, asterisk thump 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 asterisk, running footsteps from directly above us. Not just faint taps, but the unmistakable sound of something, running back and forth. I turned to look at my mother, expecting to see her smile, to tell us it was just a coincidence. But her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She froze, staring at the ceiling, and for a moment, it seemed like the entire room was holding its breath. My heart started racing in my chest. My mother quickly pulled out her phone, dialing the local cop who patrolled our area, and then the maintenance guy who worked for the complex. She gave them a quick explanation, her voice sharp and filled with urgency. They arrived within minutes, their footsteps echoing in the hall as they made their way up the stairs. I remember standing there, feeling that odd mix of fear and curiosity, not knowing what was going to happen next. My mother was pacing, clearly disturbed by what we'd just heard. The officers and maintenance guy went up to the vacant apartment, and we stayed behind, trying to make sense of what was happening. My mind kept replaying those footsteps, the sound of someone running above us, just as my mother had described. The minutes seemed to drag on forever before they came back down. The officer looked at my mother with a confused but sympathetic look. "It wasn't what you thought," he said. "There was a woman up there with her 2 kids, sure, but they didn't die in an accident." He paused for a moment, glancing back up the stairs before continuing. Turns out a homeless woman had been living there for a while. She snuck in through an open window and had been hiding there with her children. The place was in disarray, clothes scattered, blankets piled up. We've called social services, and the kids are with foster care now. The mother, she's gone. I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me, mixed with confusion. My mom looked completely drained, as if the weight of the situation had taken everything out of her. The footsteps we heard earlier weren't ghosts. They were the sound of a desperate mother and her children, trying to survive in an abandoned apartment. She never spoke about ghosts or creepy stories again after that day, and I think we all felt a little less uneasy about the complex. A few years later, we moved to a different apartment complex. My mom had been managing properties for a while, and this one was a little bigger. There were more units, and it seemed like a nicer neighborhood. I was older now, a teenager, and I had grown more independent. I would often go with my mom when she had to check on the vacant apartments. One day, she needed help going through some of the units, checking to see if anything needed to be repaired or replaced before showing them to potential tenants. It was a quiet day, no maintenance staff working, so it was just me and her. We walked through the building, and everything seemed fine at first. We went through a couple of units, nothing out of the ordinary. The place was quiet, and the air felt stagnant, like it hadn't been lived in for a while. I remember thinking how creepy it was that some of these units had been empty for months. It felt like stepping into a different world, where time had stopped. Then we reached one apartment. The door was already open, just slightly ajar. It didn't seem like a big deal at first, maybe just some neighborhood kids messing around. The lock was broken, I assumed. But as we stepped inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. My mom went straight for the master bedroom, leaving me standing in the living room. I was facing the windows, looking out at the empty parking lot and the street beyond. It was such a normal, suburban scene. Cars passing by, people walking their dogs. But there was a tension in the air, something I couldn't quite explain. It was as if something was about to happen, though I didn't know what. I heard my mom's voice from the back of the apartment, calling out to me. It wasn't a normal call, it was filled with panic. "Come here now." I ran as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest, my feet slapping against the hardwood floors as I made my way to the back of the apartment. When I reached the master bedroom, I froze. In the closet stood a girl. She was pale, almost white as snow, her body hunched over, her nails dug deep into the wooden wall, as if she was trying to climb it or escape something. She was half naked, trembling, and there was a look in her eyes, a look that I can't forget to this day. It was the look of someone who had been through hell. My mom's voice broke through my shock. "Go get help. Now." I didn't think. I just turned and ran. I bolted out of the apartment and made my way to the main office, hoping to find the security guard. But before I could get there, something stopped me dead in my tracks. A man, tall, probably around 6'3", came running out of the kitchen, heading straight toward me. His face was filled with panic, and his movements were erratic. For a split second, our eyes met, and I saw something in his expression that made my blood run cold. He wasn't afraid of getting caught. He was desperate to get away. Without thinking, I chased him. My legs burned as I ran after him, trying to keep up, but he had a head start. We sprinted down the hallway, through the courtyard, and into the parking lot. I must have chased him for 400 or 500 feet before I lost sight of him behind a building. I turned around, my heart hammering in my chest, and ran back to the apartment. By the time I got there, my mom was already on the phone, calling the authorities. The girl had been the victim of a sexual assault, and the man was the one responsible. I remember feeling sick, nauseous, but also strangely calm. I knew I had just narrowly missed something horrible, and I knew that girl's life had been changed forever. The police arrived not long after, and they searched the complex for the man. They eventually found him a few blocks away, hiding in a nearby alley. He was arrested, and the girl was taken to the hospital. My mom and I never spoke about that day again, but I think we both knew we had just witnessed something far darker than either of us were ready for. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the image of that girl from my mind, or the way she looked at me when I walked into the room. It was as if she knew exactly what was happening, even if she couldn't understand why. I never told anyone about what I saw that day, not in detail anyway. My mother didn't either. It was something we both kept to ourselves, buried deep down. That was the last time I ever went with my mom to check on the apartments. After that, I stayed far away from those vacant units. My mother kept managing the building, but something in her changed, too. She stopped telling us ghost stories. Maybe it was because she realized the real horrors in the world were much darker than any ghost could be. I think, in the end, we both understood that the scariest things weren't the things we couldn't see or explain. They were the things that lived in plain sight, hiding in the shadows, just waiting for the right moment to strike. This past summer, I worked in a closed-down asylum. It wasn't anything glamorous. My role was mostly behind the scenes, paperwork, filing, that kind of thing. But as someone who had recently graduated with a sociology degree, I found myself intrigued by the building's history. The asylum, or what was left of it, was massive. Stretching over a few acres, its crumbling walls seemed to hold decades of secrets. I wasn't supposed to get into the past of the place, but it was hard to ignore. And so my curiosity grew. The building had been abandoned for years, but they were still storing old records, and I was tasked with helping organize them. Most of the rooms we worked in were locked, repurposed spaces. Some used to be rooms where patients lived. Others had been transformed into storage or offices. But there was one room, an old cafeteria, that was off limits. Even my co-workers didn't want to go near it. They always said the same thing: bad memories in there. I didn't take their warnings seriously at first. It was just an old building with some history, I told myself. But one evening, when I was deep in the basement of the asylum, I decided to dive into its history. After all, this was the very place where I was working, and it had its share of gruesome pasts. I found an article online about a woman named Patricia. Her son had been in the asylum in the 1970s. The piece was brief, but it struck a nerve. He had died by suicide. From what I gathered, he was terrified of the treatment he would receive there. He had been just a kid, in his teens, struggling with his own demons, and yet his story ended in tragedy. Patricia had fought to keep him out of the asylum, but ultimately had to let him go. He ended up dead. The article mentioned that she always believed his death was partly due to the fear of being mistreated in the institution. That haunted me. I couldn't shake the thought of this mother losing her son to a place like this. The days following my discovery, I found myself thinking about it more and more. Something about it all felt wrong, but I couldn't explain why. I chalked it up to the eerie atmosphere of the place. The asylum had a reputation, sure, but so did a lot of buildings like this. I had heard rumors of mistreatment, cruel doctors, and unspeakable acts, but that didn't prepare me for the dream. It happened a few nights later. I was asleep in my apartment when I woke up, or thought I did. I could see an old woman sitting at the edge of my bed, her back hunched, her hands shaking. She was crying, sobbing uncontrollably. Her face was twisted in anguish, and she kept staring at me. Her eyes were filled with pain, betrayal. She screamed at me over and over. "How could you work there? How could you?" Her voice was raw, and it reverberated inside my head. I couldn't understand her words, but the emotion was unmistakable. She was angry. She blamed me. I tried to speak, to say something to her, but the words didn't come. The dream felt so real, so tangible. I could feel the weight of her eyes, her pain, and it suffocated me. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, but I couldn't wake up. I was trapped in that room with her, unable to move. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. When I finally woke up, it was morning, and the fear lingered. That old woman's face, her eyes, kept haunting me. The dream was vivid, and for the first time, I started to question why I was even working in that place. I hadn't asked myself that before, but now the guilt was gnawing at me. What was I doing there? A few days later, I went back to work. I tried to ignore the dream, tried to chalk it up to stress, but the unease wouldn't leave. The basement became a place I avoided. The other intern I worked with, Claire, didn't seem to mind, but I noticed how quiet it always was down there. Even the air felt different, thick with something I couldn't name. One afternoon, we found ourselves in one of the locked rooms, filing old medical records. It was in one of the building's oldest sections, a place with narrow hallways and dim lighting. The room was filled with boxes of records, most of them medical files of patients who had passed away in the 1960s and 70s. I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread as I looked at the boxes, knowing the lives they represented, the people who had suffered within these walls. We stood in front of the door to one of the rooms, trying to unlock it. Claire had the key, but it wouldn't turn. She twisted and turned it, her frustration growing. "This is weird," she muttered, giving it another go. I stood beside her, staring at the door. The longer I watched her struggle with the lock, the more vivid the image became. I saw a young man in the room. He was thin, gaunt, pale. He looked like he had been there for years, like a ghost, but he wasn't. He was real, or had been. He had hung himself in that room. I knew it. The key twisted again, and the door opened. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest as Claire and I exchanged a look, and then, without saying a word, stepped inside. The room was empty, of course. It was just another storage room. But the moment I crossed the threshold, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The young man, Whoever he was didn't want us there. I could feel his presence. He was angry, holding the door shut, stopping us from coming in. I shuddered as I placed the records on the table, feeling eyes on me the entire time. We didn't talk as we left the room. The silence was uncomfortable, but I couldn't bring myself to say anything. The feeling of dread lingered in the air like a fog. It wasn't the first time I had felt this way while working there, but it was the worst. It was as if the history of this place was crawling under my skin, digging its way into my mind. Every corner of the asylum felt like it was watching me, waiting for me to discover something I wasn't supposed to. The weight of the past, the suicides, the suffering, the cruelty, had a way of settling in my bones. Then there was the body prep room. We had been told about it in passing. The staff spoke about it with a strange kind of reverence, like it was a place to be avoided. The building had been used for body preparation before the morgue was built on the grounds. We didn't know which room was the one they used, but Claire and I accidentally stumbled upon it. It was locked, of course, but when we finally got inside, it was as though time had stopped. The room was set up like an old autopsy lab, with metal tables that still had traces of something I couldn't place. There were boxes filled with supplies, some of them still in their original packaging, untouched for decades. The air was stale, but there was something else in it. A smell. It wasn't unpleasant, but it made my stomach turn. There were marks on the floor, dark stains that I couldn't identify, but I had an idea. And as we stood there, the lights flickered, and for just a moment, I could have sworn I saw shadows moving in the corners of the room. We left quickly, but that experience stuck with me. I couldn't stop thinking about it. How could something so terrible, so horrific, just be locked away, forgotten? By the time the summer ended, I was done. I had my fill of old records, haunted rooms, and creeping unease. I never went back to the asylum. The history, the pain, the lives lost had gotten to me. It had all taken its toll, and I knew I couldn't keep working in a place like that. Not with those dreams, not with those memories. The article about Patricia and her son still sits on my desk. I keep it there, even though I don't know why. I don't visit the website anymore. I don't need to. What I learned that summer, the thing that stayed with me, is that history, no matter how much you try to bury it, never stays buried. It clings to places. It clings to people. It's there always. You can feel it, just under the surface, waiting to be uncovered. And sometimes, it will scream at you until you listen. It had only been 2 or 3 days since my dad died. I could still smell the lingering scent of the garage, old gasoline rust, the faintest hint of sweat, and the image of his body, still hanging there, kept flashing into my mind like some kind of cruel slideshow I couldn't turn off. It had been surreal, waking up that morning and knowing something was wrong, but not understanding exactly how bad it was until I stepped outside and saw my mom's face. When she said, "Your dad's gone," I couldn't process it. Gone. What did that even mean? He was just in the kitchen last night, having his usual coffee, complaining about work, making the usual jokes I never really listened to. But he was gone. And now, just a couple of days later, things didn't feel real. The house felt like a ghost of what it used to be. Every room quiet and empty. I hated being there, hated every creak of the floorboards, every crack of the walls. The grief hadn't hit yet. It was more like a numbness that stretched over everything. The way my brain just couldn't comprehend that he was dead, that he was gone for good. That night, the night I saw the garage door open, I was outside. I didn't want to be inside the house. Being inside felt too heavy, like the air was thick with something I couldn't escape. My aunt was there too. She had shown up right after everything happened. She was a fundamentalist Christian, and that came with its own set of beliefs that I didn't always understand. I wasn't religious myself, but I didn't argue with her when she said we should pray. I just let her do her thing, staying out of her way. My mom was inside, sitting in the living room, not saying much, probably trying to process things in her own way. Everyone was quiet, and that's when I saw it. I'd been outside, standing near the side of the house, staring into the dark. The kind of darkness you only get in the country, total blackness, so deep it felt like the world could swallow you whole if you let it. I don't even remember why I was outside. Maybe just to breathe, maybe just to be away from the house. I don't even remember the moment I noticed the garage door opening. Maybe it was the wind, but I didn't hear it. I didn't hear anything. The door just opened, like it was being pulled by some invisible hand. The motion was smooth, unnatural. I froze, confused. The light inside the garage flickered on, then off, on again, off again. It was as if someone was playing with the light switch, flicking it on and off repeatedly. It wasn't a normal flicker like a faulty bulb. No, this was deliberate, like someone was messing with it. But I couldn't see anyone inside. My heart raced. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the power was unstable. Maybe the switch was malfunctioning. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I kept staring at that dark garage, hoping for an explanation. Hoping for a rational explanation. But there was no one inside. I knew that for sure. The garage was empty. My aunt and mom were inside the house. They hadn't activated the garage door opener, and I was sure of that. It was just me standing there, staring, watching the light flick on and off like a sick joke. I was drunk, I'll admit that. I had been drinking earlier in the evening, just trying to numb the pain, trying to make everything feel more bearable. But this, what I was seeing now, this was too real. It didn't feel like a hallucination, even if I had been drinking. The garage light kept flickering, in and out, faster now, almost like it was trying to get my attention. I could feel the tension in the air, a tightness in my chest, and I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I told myself it was just a malfunction. Maybe I was still processing everything. But I also knew my aunt was inside, and if she saw me standing out there like this, she'd probably think it was something else entirely. She had a way of interpreting things that didn't make sense to me. She was quick to say it was demons, that they were attracted to the house after my dad's death, trying to mess with our heads. I didn't know what to believe. But I did know this. I couldn't stand there anymore. I couldn't watch that light flickering like that. I turned around and hurried back inside, closing the door behind me with a little too much force. Inside, the house was silent, but it felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I told myself it was just the grief, the stress. But the more I tried to brush it off, the more the image of that light kept flashing in my mind. I didn't mention it to anyone, not right away. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened, something I couldn't explain. My aunt was the first person to say something, of course. She found me the next morning, and as usual, gave me her whole interpretation of events. She wasn't one to shy away from these kinds of things. According to her, my dad's death had somehow invited dark forces into the house, demons that were now messing with us. She said they were playing with our minds, taunting us. I couldn't even begin to argue with her, not in the state I was in. But the thing was, I didn't believe in any of that. It felt wrong to even think about it. I wasn't sure what I believed in, but I knew that ghosts or demons weren't the answer to what I saw that night. There had to be something else, something real. But what? What could it have been? I never told my mom about the light. I didn't want to upset her more than she already was. She was barely holding it together as it was. I never mentioned it again, not to anyone. The memory was fading, anyway. The more I thought about it, the more unreliable it felt. Maybe it was the drinking, maybe it was the shock. Either way, I didn't want to revisit it. A couple of weeks later, I moved out. The house had become too much, too overwhelming. The grief, the guilt, the weight of everything. It was too much for me to handle. I couldn't stay there, and I didn't want to. When I was alone in the house cleaning up, there was no light flickering, no weird feelings. But still, the memory of that night lingered, tucked away in the back of my mind, like something I couldn't quite let go of. I didn't experience anything else in the house during those last few days. It was like everything had settled down, gone back to normal, or at least as normal as it could be. But I still wondered about that night. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Was it just a malfunction? Or was it something else? And why did I feel like I was alone in that house, even when I was surrounded by family? I never found answers. But it didn't matter. I couldn't keep thinking about it. I couldn't keep searching for an explanation for something that might have just been my mind playing tricks on me. What I did know was that I couldn't stay there. I couldn't stay in that house, with its creaky floors, its empty rooms, and its ghosts, real or imagined. Moving out felt like the only choice. Sleep paralysis. For as long as I can remember, it's been something that I just couldn't shake. At first, I thought it was some kind of weird one-off experience, something that would eventually stop happening. But it didn't. It came again and again, always in the same terrifying form. I never got used to it. It usually begins like this. I start waking up, but something isn't quite right. My body feels heavy, like I'm buried under a mountain of blankets or weighted down by something invisible. I can hear everything around me, but it's like I'm stuck, trapped in this moment where I can't move or speak. My chest is tight, and there's this pressure like something or someone is sitting on me. It feels so real. I can't breathe right. The air feels thick, like I'm trying to suck in air through a straw. But the worst part, the whispers, they're always there. I don't know where they come from, and I can never understand what they're saying. But they're everywhere. The voices swirl around me, barely audible, like distant murmurs in a crowded room, too faint to make out, but still there. It's like they're coming from the walls, the air, or maybe even my own thoughts. Sometimes it's calm, but sometimes it feels like the whispers are getting louder and louder, almost as if they're trying to suffocate me with sound. But I can't move. I can't do anything but lie there, feeling like my heart is going to burst out of my chest from the panic that rises in my throat. And then I see her, every single time. It starts small, this strange, creeping sensation of someone sitting on me. The weight on my chest increases, and I know, even before I open my eyes, that she's there. She always sits just above me, her small figure, cloaked in an old white lace dress. Her hair is long and black, hanging down in a way that makes it look like a curtain. I can never see her face at first because her back is facing me. It's just her thin, skeletal figure, motionless, except for that feeling of pressure building and building. I try to fight it. I try to move, to get away from her. But my limbs are paralyzed, my body unwilling to listen. I can't breathe, I can't scream, and I can't even blink. But I can feel it. She's there, watching me. Even though I can't see her face, I know she's watching me. The worst part is that she always turns her head. Slowly, very slowly, like she's savoring the moment. Her head creaks as it moves, like the sound of old bones rubbing together. It's a horrible sound, one that makes my skin crawl. And as her head moves, the whispers get louder and louder, like they're building up to something. At first, it's just faint, distant sounds, like static on a radio. But as she turns her head, the sound gets more distinct. The whispers grow sharper, more frantic, like something is right behind me, breathing down my neck. I can feel my heart racing in my chest, but I can't do anything about it. My whole body is frozen. And then, before I can stop myself, I close my eyes. I always do. I know that if I keep them open, I'll see her face. I don't know why I'm so afraid of it. I've never seen it fully, not in the dozens of times this has happened. But something in my gut tells me that seeing her face is something I'm not ready for. Something that will break me, that will make all the fear real. So I close my eyes, tightly, desperately trying to block out the sounds, the pressure, the feeling of her watching me. The whispers get louder still, echoing in my ears like a roar. My chest feels like it's going to collapse under the weight of her, and I feel like I'm suffocating. It's deafening now, and I just want it to stop. I want to wake up fully, to be able to move and scream and fight back. But all I can do is lie there in that horrible, paralyzed state, hoping that whatever this is will just go away. And then, just as suddenly as it began, everything goes silent. The silence is worse than anything. It's like the calm after a storm, the kind of quiet that wraps around you and makes you question whether or not everything is still real. The pressure on my chest lifts, and for a split second, I feel like I can move again. My body still feels heavy, like the weight of sleep has dragged me down into the deepest part of my mind. But I can move. I can breathe. But I can't open my eyes. Not yet. I know that if I do, everything will come rushing back, and I'll be trapped in that nightmare once again. I can't risk it. I just can't. I lie there in the dark, in that perfect, awful silence, forcing myself to breathe evenly, slowly, trying to calm the racing of my heart. The longer I lie there, the more I begin to doubt that I'm even awake. Is this really happening? Or is this just another dream, a hallucination, a cruel trick my mind plays on me every month? Eventually, my body begins to regain its strength. I start to feel the sensation in my arms and legs again, but I still don't open my eyes. I don't want to know if she's still there. I don't want to see if she's still watching me, waiting for me to make a move. So I do the only thing I can do. I force myself to fall back asleep. It's a strange thing, this cycle of sleep paralysis. It's like living in two worlds at once. I'm awake, but I'm not. My mind is alert, but my body is trapped, imprisoned in that moment between sleep and reality. And every time, it's the same whispers, the same little girl in the white lace dress, the same feeling of dread that settles over me like a heavy blanket. It happens at least once a month, like clockwork. Each time, it feels a little different, but it's always the same in the end. That girl, the whispers, the pressure. It never goes away. And every time, I pray that maybe, just maybe, this will be the time that it stops. But it doesn't. I've learned to live with it, to accept it as a part of who I am. I've become an expert at pretending like nothing is wrong, like nothing is happening. I've learned how to breathe through it, to force myself back to sleep when everything inside me is screaming to run. But it never really goes away. The fear lingers. And I think maybe, in some deep, hidden part of me, I'm afraid that one night, when I open my eyes, I'll see her face. When I was about 8 or 9, my family moved into a small house tucked away in a quiet cul-de-sac. It was the kind of place that felt isolated even though there were other houses nearby. The neighborhood was hidden, surrounded by big trees that blocked most of the view from the main roads. You wouldn't even know it was there unless you were looking for it. The house itself was a single story with a big backyard, way bigger than what you'd expect in a suburban area. It stretched far, almost too far for a normal yard, and something about it always felt off. My sisters and I played outside a lot, but we never went to one particular corner, the one with the rusted-out trailer. It sat there, old and forgotten, like it had been dumped and never moved again. The metal frame was bent, and the wheels were half buried in the dirt. I don't know why, but we all avoided it. Even our dog, who would normally chase anything that moved, never went near it. If a ball rolled too close, we'd just leave it. None of us ever talked about why. We just knew that part of the yard wasn't safe. Inside the house, things weren't much better. My 2 younger sisters shared a bedroom, but every so often, they would come sleep in mine. They always had some excuse, usually about weird lights in their room. My parents told them it was just the street lights shining through the blinds, but that explanation never made sense. The window in their room faced the backyard, and there were no street lights back there. At first, I thought they were just being dramatic. But then one night, I woke up to something that made me question everything. It started with a feeling. Not fear exactly, but something worse. Anger. It was like standing next to someone who was boiling with rage, like I had done something terrible and was about to pay for it. I could feel it pressing down on me, thick and suffocating. I opened my eyes, and there was someone standing in my doorway. A dark shape. No details, no features, just the outline of a person. And then a single red light, small and glowing, like the tip of a cigarette burning in the darkness. Both of my parents smoked, so for a moment, I thought it was one of them. I sat up, my heart pounding. Mom, Dad, no answer. I blinked, and in that instant, the figure was gone. The red light vanished. I yanked the covers over my head, curling into a tight ball, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Just a trick of the eyes. A shadow. Maybe I imagined it. Then something tugged at my blankets. It wasn't gentle, like when a pet jumps on the bed and shifts the covers. It was a sharp pull, like someone trying to rip them away. I froze. Another tug. My body felt locked in place, too scared to move, too scared to breathe. I clenched the blankets in my fists, holding them as tight as I could. Then nothing. The pulling stopped, but I stayed under the covers, afraid to peek out. My whole body was tense, waiting for something else to happen. I don't remember how long I stayed like that, but eventually exhaustion took over, and I fell asleep. In the morning, I told my parents about it. They brushed it off, saying they hadn't left their room all night. My mom told me it was just a nightmare. Maybe I had kicked the blankets in my sleep. Maybe the red light was a leftover image from a dream. She made it all sound so simple, so easy to explain away. But it didn't feel like a dream. Years passed, but the memories of that house never left me. Even after we moved, I kept having nightmares about it. Always the same. There was one specific part of the house that haunted my dreams, the corner of the garage-turned den. In real life, the den was an open space, connected to the rest of the house. But in my dreams, there were stairs that didn't exist. They led down into the den, and at the bottom, in the farthest corner, was a black hole. Not a literal hole, not something you could fall into, but a darkness so thick it might as well have been. I knew deep down, in that way you just know things in dreams, that if I got too close, if I stepped near the edge, something inside would grab me. I had other nightmares too, ones where the entire neighborhood felt wrong. In those dreams, every house on the cul-de-sac was empty, abandoned. but I knew that if I went to one for help, I wouldn't come back. I always woke up before anything could happen, but the fear lingered long after I was awake. For years, I thought I was alone in this. Then one night, I was talking with my mom and my younger sister, just reminiscing about the past. Somehow, we ended up on the topic of that house. My sister got quiet, then admitted that she had nightmares about it too. They weren't exactly like mine, but they were close. In her dreams, she ran down a set of stairs that shouldn't exist. Instead of the den, she ended up in the kitchen, where the cupboards would slam open and shut on their own. And there was always a man standing in the den, watching. We had never spoken about this before. Not once. And yet, our dreams lined up in a way that was impossible to ignore. Our mom sat there, listening, a strange expression on her face. Then she admitted that she had felt uneasy in that house too. Not just the usual discomfort of a creepy old house, but something worse, something deeper. I've driven by that neighborhood a few times as an adult. The house is still there, looking exactly the same. The cul-de-sac still feels hidden, tucked away from the rest of the world. And every time I pass by, I feel it again, that same eerie sensation, like something watching from the shadows. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe we were just kids with overactive imaginations. Or maybe some places hold on to things that never really leave. I never thought much about the trail behind Walmart. It was just a shortcut, a convenient little path through some overgrown grass and scattered trees, leading straight to the side of the store. I had walked it dozens of times, usually during the day, but at night, it always felt a little different. Not unsafe, exactly, just strange. That night, my boyfriend and I were heading to Walmart to grab some stuff for root beer floats. It wasn't that late, maybe 9 or 10, but the sky was completely dark. Streetlights barely reached the back of the store, and the forested area around it seemed to swallow what little light there was. We took the familiar trail, our footsteps crunching on dry leaves and gravel. The air was cool, and the only sound was the distant hum of cars from the main road. As we neared the back of the building, I noticed movement near the edge of the trees, a black shape, low to the ground, sniffing at the dirt. A dog. At least, I thought it was a dog. It wasn't that unusual. Strays sometimes wandered through, probably looking for food. Something about it was off, though. It was too still. Its body didn't shift like a normal dog's would when sniffing around. It was just there. I was joking when I said it. What if it's some sort of creature? The words had barely left my mouth when the dog's head snapped up, almost too fast, like it had been yanked by an invisible string. Its eyes locked onto us. For a second, everything felt frozen. Then it moved. I have never seen anything move like that. One moment it was standing there, the next it was gone, like a shadow breaking apart. It didn't just run. It tore across the ground like it had been shot out of a cannon, faster than any dog should be able to move. My stomach clenched. The speed of it didn't make sense. It didn't bark, didn't growl, just vanished into the night, leaving only silence behind. We didn't talk about it much as we continued walking. I wasn't sure what to say. It was weird, sure, but maybe it had just been a trick of the light. A normal dog running away. Maybe my eyes had exaggerated the speed in the dark. That's what I told myself. But it didn't feel normal. A couple of months passed. I hadn't thought much about the dog since that night. Life went on as usual. Then, my neighbor mentioned something that made my stomach twist. She and her son had seen a dog behind Walmart. A big black dog, roaming near the back of the store. I felt a chill creep up my spine before she even finished the story. Then she told me that when it saw them, it took off running at the speed of light. I tried to laugh it off. Just a weird coincidence, right? Strays pass through all the time. It wasn't like black dogs were rare. But the way she described it, the speed, the way it disappeared like a blur, it was too similar, too exact. And then a few weeks later, my boyfriend came home, out of breath, a look on his face I hadn't seen before. He wasn't the kind of person to get rattled easily, but he looked rattled then. He had seen the dog again, and this time he was sure. After that, I couldn't let it go. I started paying attention when I walked that trail, glancing toward the tree line every time I passed. Most of the time, there was nothing but shadows. But sometimes I thought I saw something, just out of the corner of my eye, a patch of darkness that didn't quite match the rest. The way I remembered it, the dog hadn't just been black. It had been black in a way that absorbed light. Like it wasn't fur, but a hole, a void in the shape of a dog. One night, I went out alone. I wasn't looking for it, not really. I was just restless, thinking too much about it, needing to prove to myself that it had been nothing. A stray, a trick of the dark. I took the usual path. The back of Walmart was as empty as ever. The dumpsters sat in their usual spots, the parking lot mostly quiet, a few cars scattered near the front entrance. The air smelled like pavement and faint traces of garbage. Then I heard it. Not a bark, not a growl, just movement. Something shifting just past the tree line, in the undergrowth. My heart started pounding. I stood there, staring, trying to make sense of the shape in the dark. It was low to the ground, completely still. I wasn't sure if I had even noticed it moving, or if my brain had just felt something was there. Then it started to move toward me. I didn't see its legs, just motion. Fast, too fast. I stumbled back, nearly losing my footing on the uneven pavement. My breath caught in my throat. Then, like before, it vanished. Not into the trees, not into the shadows, just gone. After that, I stopped walking the trail at night. I still don't know what I saw. Maybe it really was just a stray dog. Maybe my brain played tricks on me in the dark. But the speed, it wasn't normal. The way it moved, it wasn't normal. And I wasn't the only one who saw it. First me and my boyfriend, then my neighbor, then my boyfriend again. And the thing that keeps nagging at me, the thing I can't shake. If it was just a dog, why did it keep showing up behind Walmart? Why did it always run the second it was seen? And why did it feel like it wasn't really running away, but disappearing? The year was 2004, and I was 16 years old when my parents decided we needed a vacation. They had always been the adventurous type, but this trip was different. This was supposed to be a trip to relax, to escape the routine, and to just spend time as a family. We packed the car and drove through the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina and up into Western Virginia. We saw Asheville, Natural Bridge, and countless other scenic spots. But what I remember the most, what has stayed with me, was not the beautiful vistas, but something I saw late one night in a hotel in Lexington, Virginia. Something I still don't fully understand. We were staying at an old Howard Johnson's on a hill near the outskirts of town. It was rundown, shabby, and the kind of place that felt like it hadn't been renovated in decades. There was a certain musty smell in the hallway, and the carpet in our room was worn down, threads fraying at the edges. But at that point, I was just glad to get off the road. We'd been driving for hours, and all I wanted was to sleep. My mom and dad had been in a terrible car accident years before, in the 70s, and since then, things had never been quite the same for her. She couldn't sleep on her back anymore, and as a result, she always had to bring a reclining chair with her whenever we traveled. She would sleep sitting up, while my dad would take the bed. I was in my own bed near the sliding glass door that led to a small porch. I didn't mind the arrangement. I was used to it. I remember the night starting out just like any other on a road trip. After unpacking our things, we settled into bed. My parents were already asleep, the low hum of their breathing filling the room. But for some reason, I couldn't fall asleep right away. Maybe it was the exhaustion from the drive, or maybe it was the fact that the room felt a little too quiet, too still. It wasn't long before I finally drifted off, the fatigue taking over. But it didn't last. I woke up in the middle of the night, the urge to pee suddenly too strong to ignore. I opened my eyes, adjusting to the dim light that filtered in from the streetlights outside. The room was mostly dark, but my eyes quickly adjusted, and I could see my mom in her chair, right where she always sat to sleep. Her chair blocked the hallway to the bathroom, and my dad was lying in the bed to her right, his back turned to me. I shifted in bed, preparing to get up, but then something caught my eye. At first, I thought I was just groggy, still half dreaming. But no, it was real. Standing behind my mom, just inches away from her, was a figure. It was tall, almost 7 feet tall, cloaked in darkness. The cloak looked like a hooded robe, but it seemed to ripple with movement, as if it wasn't quite part of the world around it. I could barely make out the shape of its face, but what I could see froze me to the core. The figure had a hooked, skeletal hand, and it was reaching out toward my mom's shoulder. I didn't know what I was looking at. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, trying to convince myself that this was just some kind of trick of the light, maybe a shadow from a passing car outside. But no, this thing was too real, too distinct. I blinked, hoping it would disappear, but it didn't. It stood there, just behind my mom, watching me. My heart started to race. I felt a cold sweat break out along the back of my neck, and I couldn't move. I just stared at it, frozen, not knowing what to do. My breath caught in my throat as the figure turned its head toward me. Its face, if you could even call it a face, was empty, hollow, like a void staring back at me. It was as if it had no eyes, no features, just a dark abyss. And then it moved. The cloak rippled with the motion, and I felt a surge of panic so intense I thought I might pass out. I was absolutely certain this thing was going to reach out and touch me, to come closer, to do something awful. No, I couldn't let that happen. In an instant, I yanked the blanket up over my head, diving under it, pulling it down tight around me. I don't even know if I made a conscious decision to do it, but my body moved on its own, driven by a sheer, overwhelming terror. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see it anymore. I just wanted to hide, to make it go away. But as I lay there, under the covers, my mind screamed. What if it was still there? What if it came closer? What if I looked out from under the blanket, and it was standing right next to me? I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and for what felt like hours, I just lay there wide-eyed and frozen, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. At some point, I must have lost consciousness. I didn't fall asleep. I fainted. My body had been pushed to its limit, the fear so intense that I couldn't even stay conscious. The last thing I remember thinking before I passed out was that if I came out from under the covers, it would be standing right beside me, waiting to do whatever it came to do. The next morning, I woke up to the sounds of my parents getting ready. I blinked, disoriented, my heart still racing, the remnants of the terror I'd felt the night before still lingering in my chest. I looked around the room, half expecting to see the figure still there, standing silently in the corner. But no, the room was just as it had been before I fell asleep. My mom was sitting in her chair, her eyes focused on the small TV in the corner, and my dad was at the bathroom sink. I didn't wait long. As soon as I could, I told them. I didn't know how to explain it, but I had to tell them what I saw. I could feel the words tumbling out of my mouth, my voice shaky with the remnants of fear. I described the figure, the cloak, the skeletal hand, the feeling of absolute dread that washed over me. But they didn't react the way I expected. They didn't laugh or call me crazy, but they exchanged a strange look. My mom looked at my dad, then back at me, her eyes full of something I couldn't read. The silence in the room stretched out, and I felt a knot form in my stomach. This wasn't the reaction I was expecting. It didn't make me feel any better. Then my mom spoke. She told me something that sent a chill through me. She said that in the middle of the night, she had woken up to a glowing hand on her shoulder. She said it felt warm, comforting, and full of pure joy. The hand had been behind her, in the very spot where I'd seen that thing standing. It had come to her in the night, just like it had come to me, but she didn't feel fear. She felt peace. She told my dad about it downstairs at the continental breakfast before I even woke up. 2 different experiences, 2 different reactions, but somehow they had both been connected to the same spot in the room, the same moment in time. My dad was upset. He had not seen anything. He was genuinely disappointed that he hadn't experienced what my mom had. He had always been skeptical about things like that, but he seemed almost jealous that he hadn't had some kind of spiritual encounter like my mom had. There was something strange in the air, something unsettling. 2 months later, my dad was killed in a car accident. It was sudden and unexpected, and it felt like everything had changed in an instant. It felt as though he had been taken away, and we were left with the pieces of what was once our family. And then I started to wonder, what had I seen that night? Was it a warning? Was it a sign? My mom had felt joy, peace, comfort from the same presence that terrified me. Could it have been a messenger? Was it trying to comfort her, to prepare her for the pain that was to come? Or was it something else, something darker, something that I just couldn't comprehend? I never found answers. I never fully understood what happened that night in that rundown hotel in Lexington. Was it just a product of my imagination, a fear-induced hallucination? Or was there something real in that room, something that only I could see? All I know is that it happened, and it left a mark on me that I can't shake. The memory of that figure, the way it looked, the way it moved, the way it made me feel. Those things will never leave me. And the fact that my mom saw something completely different, something that comforted her, only makes it harder to understand. I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was good or bad. But I know one thing for sure. Whatever it was, it changed my life in ways I'll never fully comprehend. And as I sit here now, years later, I can't help but wonder, what was the true purpose of that moment? And will I ever understand it? A few years ago, I was living with my sister because she and her boyfriend were having problems. They were fighting constantly, and at some point, he just decided to stay somewhere else. She was scared to be alone in the house, so I moved in. I didn't mind. Free internet, free food, sounded like a good deal to me. Her place wasn't anything fancy, just a small one-story house in a quiet neighborhood. The kind where everyone kept to themselves, mostly older people who had been there for years. It was the kind of place where nothing really happened. No loud parties, no crime, nothing exciting at all. It was the kind of quiet that should have been comforting, but for some reason, never really was. I slept on the couch in the living room. It wasn't the best setup, but it worked. The couch was right by a window that faced the street, which meant I could hear every car that drove by at night. Across from me, against the wall near the front door, was another couch. My sister's room was down the hallway, door closed at night. Most nights were uneventful. I'd stay up late on my phone, watch TV until I got tired, then crash. That was the routine. But one night, something happened that I still can't explain. I don't remember the dream that woke me up. I just remember the feeling it left behind, like something wasn't right. My heart was racing, and I felt this weird pressure in my chest, like I had just been running. I sat up fast, trying to shake the feeling. The room was dark, but not pitch black. The streetlight outside gave just enough of a glow through the window that I could see most of the living room. I looked around, my brain still foggy from sleep. Everything seemed normal at first. The coffee table was where it always was, my shoes by the couch, the TV remote on the floor where it had probably fallen. Nothing was out of place. But then, as my eyes moved across the room, they landed on the couch behind me. And that's when I froze. There was someone sitting there. A tall, dark figure, perfectly still. For a few seconds, I just stared, my mind struggling to catch up with what I was seeing. The figure wasn't moving, wasn't making a sound. It sat upright on the couch, arms folded into each other, head tilted downward just enough that I couldn't see inside the hood it was wearing. A long, black robe covered its body, the hood pointed at the top. I don't know how long I stood there. It could have been 5 seconds, could have been a full minute. Time felt stretched, like everything had slowed down. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My first instinct was to fight, to rush at it, to defend myself, to protect my sister. But something held me back. Because the longer I looked, the more something felt off. It wasn't moving at all. No shifting, no breathing, no reaction to me suddenly sitting up. I should have seen some kind of movement, even the smallest rise and fall of breathing. But there was nothing. And that's when the fear really set in. I took a slow step backward, then another. My body felt disconnected, like I was moving underwater. I turned and ran straight into the kitchen, my brain screaming at me to grab something, anything, to defend myself. The first thing my hands found was a basketball, and I grabbed it, gripping it so tight my fingers hurt. I stood there, holding my breath, trying to listen. The house was silent, the kind of silence that felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. My pulse was so loud in my ears that I couldn't hear anything else. I kept telling myself to move, to go check, to prove to myself that there was nothing there. But my legs wouldn't cooperate. I stood in the kitchen, every muscle locked, trying to convince myself that I hadn't actually seen what I thought I had. And then, just like that, something snapped in my head. I was awake, fully awake. No more dream fog, no more confusion. Just the sharp, undeniable clarity that comes when your body is flooded with adrenaline. I forced myself to move. Slow steps, back toward the living room. The hallway light was still on, casting a soft glow into the edge of the room. I reached for the switch on the wall, fingers shaking as I flipped it on. The whole room lit up instantly, and the couch was empty. No figure, no robe, nothing. Just an empty couch, exactly the way it had been before I went to sleep. I stood there, staring at that empty space, my mind scrambling for an explanation. Maybe I had been dreaming. Maybe I had woken up too fast, still half-trapped in sleep, my brain playing tricks on me. That had to be it. I stepped closer, my body still tense, waiting for something. I reached out and touched the couch, half expecting to feel something there. But it was just fabric. Nothing else. I looked around the room, searching for anything that could have looked like what I saw. A pile of clothes, a blanket, a jacket, anything that could have played with the shadows. But there was nothing, just an empty couch and the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I stood there for a long time before finally convincing myself to sit back down. My hands were still shaking as I dropped the basketball onto the floor. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I wasn't going to wake my sister. What would I even say? That I saw something that wasn't there? That I freaked out over nothing? No, I wasn't going to sound crazy. I laid back down, staring at the ceiling, telling myself over and over that it was just a dream, just a trick of the light, just my mind playing games with me. And eventually, I fell asleep. When I woke up, sunlight was streaming through the window, casting long shadows across the floor. Everything looked so normal in the daylight that I almost laughed at myself. I sat up, stretching, still feeling the tension in my muscles from the night before. The fear had faded, replaced with embarrassment. I had let my own imagination get the best of me. But as I got up and walked past the other couch, I couldn't help but pause. Just for a second, the memory of that figure was still so vivid in my mind. The way it sat there, motionless. The way it felt like it had been watching me. I shook it off. I wasn't going to think about it anymore. And I never told anyone. Not my sister, not my friends, no one. Because even now, years later, I still don't have an answer. And I'm not sure I ever want one. I remember the summer we visited our friends in DC so clearly. We had been driving for hours, already fed up with the long stretches of highway and the monotony of the road. As much as I love road trips, at that moment, all I wanted was to stretch my legs and get some fresh air. So, instead of driving to our friend's place from the hotel, we decided to take a walk. The weather was pleasant, with a slight breeze, and the city was bustling around us. It seemed like the perfect way to unwind after hours of being cooped up in a car. The walk took us through some scenic parts of the city, past grand buildings with detailed architecture and lush green spaces. It felt nice, walking through the city with my husband. We didn't have any real plans, just letting the day unfold. At first, everything seemed completely normal, even peaceful. People walked by, some joggers passed us, and a couple of families were out enjoying the park. It felt like any other walk through a city park, nothing out of the ordinary. But as we walked deeper into the park area, something started to change. The atmosphere felt different. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was like the air thickened. The trees that had been bright and welcoming at the edge of the park now seemed a little darker, their branches hanging low. The path was winding through a mix of dense trees and open patches of grass, and although it was still daylight, a strange feeling of unease began to creep up on me. I glanced over at my husband, but he was just walking along, not noticing anything strange. I didn't want to say anything to him at first. He's not the type to pick up on that kind of thing. He's always the more optimistic one, never bothered by something as intangible as a feeling. But the deeper we went, the more I started to feel on edge, like something was wrong. I began to walk a little faster, my footsteps echoing in the quiet space. It wasn't until we reached a specific area in the park that I couldn't ignore it anymore. The air shifted in a way I can't describe, like the temperature dropped and the whole area seemed to darken just slightly, even though the sun was still shining. The trees here were more clustered together, and the space felt tight, oppressive, as if the woods themselves were closing in. There was this sense that something had happened here, something that wasn't right, that didn't belong in the peacefulness of the park. I stopped walking. I couldn't move forward, couldn't even bring myself to take another step. The feeling was so intense that I felt like I was suffocating. There was an overwhelming presence in the air, like a heavy weight pressing down on me. It was almost as if the space itself was charged with something dark, like a cloud of bad energy was hanging in the air, right over this spot. I turned to look at my husband. He had slowed his pace too, his face slightly scrunched in confusion. He wasn't the kind of person to feel or sense this kind of thing, but even he picked up on it. His eyes darted around the area, and for a brief second, I saw him hesitate. Something about the look on his face told me he felt it too. I could see it in his expression. He was unnerved, just like I was. He glanced back at me, and I didn't need to say anything. We both knew something was wrong. It was like the world around us had shifted, and the park, once so inviting, now felt like it was closing in on us. Every sound seemed muted. The birds that had been chirping earlier now silent, the leaves of the trees barely rustling despite the breeze. It was unnervingly still. Without saying a word, we both turned and started walking faster. I couldn't shake the feeling that we needed to get out of there. The longer we stayed, the heavier that presence felt. We pushed ourselves through the park, almost running at one point, and I kept looking over my shoulder as if something was following us. But when I looked back, there was nothing there, just the darkening trees and the quiet path behind us. When we finally made it out of the park and back into the city streets, I could breathe again. The heavy feeling lifted the moment we left the trees behind, but I still couldn't shake the image of that place in my mind. It felt wrong, completely wrong. My thoughts were jumbled, and I kept replaying the sensation of being watched, of something waiting just beyond the trees. We arrived at our friend's place shortly after, and as soon as we got inside, we mentioned to them that we'd taken a walk through a park on our way over. They smiled and nodded, like it was nothing special. But when we mentioned the name of the park, their faces changed. "Oh, you were in Rock Creek Park," one of them said casually. "That's where Chandra Levy's body was found. You know, the case that was all over the news years ago." I froze. The name Chandra Levy rang a bell, and as they talked more, I remembered the case, the young woman who had gone missing and was later found in the park. The thought of it sent a shiver down my spine. The park we had walked through, the very place where we had felt that unsettling presence, was the same place where something dark and horrific had occurred. I hadn't realized it at the time, but we had probably walked right past the spot where her body had been found. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. That feeling of unease, the dread that had settled in the pit of my stomach, it all made sense now. I had unknowingly been walking through a place steeped in tragedy and horror. The energy, the oppressive weight of the space, it all connected. It wasn't just my imagination or some random feeling. There was something about that park that made it different from any other park we had been in. I kept trying to piece it together in my head. We had no idea where we were when we walked through, no signs pointing to anything significant. We hadn't seen anything that could have prepared us for the sense of darkness that hung over that area. But now, knowing the history, I wondered how much the place carried with it. The dark cloud that had hovered over us, it wasn't just my mind playing tricks. It was the weight of the past, of tragedy and loss, lingering in the air. I didn't tell our friends how freaked out I had been, or how much that place had unnerved me. I just nodded along, trying to act normal, trying to shake the feeling that had stayed with me ever since. But deep down, I knew it wasn't something I could easily forget. That park, Rock Creek Park, would always be a place with a dark energy for me. A place where the past was alive, hanging over every leaf, every branch, every footstep. Since then, I've thought about that walk a lot. About the feeling that gripped me so suddenly, how it seemed to take hold of both of us without warning. I can't say for sure if we were near the exact spot where Chandra Levy's body was found, but I know that something there is different, something heavy that can't be explained. It's not just about the case or the history, it's the way the place feels. The energy is almost palpable, and now, whenever I think about that walk, I can still feel it, the dark, oppressive feeling that made me want to run as fast as I could, and how I couldn't shake the thought that something terrible had happened there. Even now, when I think about Rock Creek Park, I feel that same chill. It's a place with a dark history, one that can't be erased, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to walk through it again without that feeling of dread creeping up on me. There's something about that park, about that particular stretch we walked through, that will always haunt me. I used to run after school with my best friend, Jeff. It was a simple routine, but something about it always kept us going back for more. We didn't care about racing or setting records. We just wanted to get out there, breathe the fresh air, and push ourselves through the trails. There was one spot in particular we liked, up above a park near the edge of town. It wasn't on any map, just a small trail that ran up a steep dirt hill and then along a ridge that overlooked a wide valley. The view was breathtaking, and the area was mostly untouched, except for a few cows that grazed in the distance. A lot of people didn't know about it, so it was usually quiet. We'd run through there almost every day, usually after school. But one afternoon, something happened that completely changed how I saw that place. It wasn't something I could have predicted. It's not something I'll ever forget, either. That day, the sun had started to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the ground. It wasn't quite dark yet, but the air was starting to cool down. It was perfect for running, and we'd been pushing ourselves for the past half hour, making our way up the ridge. We paused for a moment at the top to catch our breath. It was a steep climb, but we didn't mind. We just stood there for a bit, taking in the view. Below us, the valley stretched out in all directions, green fields and distant trees as far as the eye could see. It felt peaceful up there, like we were the only ones who knew about this little slice of the world. But that peace didn't last. It came from below us, from the thick brush at the base of the hill. A sound. At first, I thought maybe it was just an animal, a cow or a deer maybe. Something natural. But as soon as I heard it, I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was wrong. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't something that should be making that sound. My entire body froze. It wasn't a growl or a howl. It wasn't a familiar animal noise at all. There was something off about it, something that made my skin crawl. It sounded like it was coming from an animal, but it was distorted, somehow, twisted, like something was trying to make noise, but couldn't quite get it right. It was hard to describe exactly what it was, but it was loud enough to send an immediate wave of panic through me. I looked at Jeff, and I could see it in his eyes. He heard it too. Whatever that was, we both knew we needed to leave. It wasn't like any sound I had ever heard before, and every instinct in my body screamed at me that we weren't supposed to be there. The thing about fear is that it doesn't always make sense. Sometimes your body reacts before your mind can figure out why. It was like that for me. My heart was racing, and I was suddenly hyper-aware of every little sound around us, the wind rustling the leaves, my own shallow breaths. My body just knew something wasn't right, and I had to leave. We didn't talk. There was no time. I turned, and Jeff was already a step ahead of me, moving quickly down the ridge, his feet sure on the loose dirt. We both started to move fast, instinctively picking up speed. I don't know if we were running from the sound or from something else, but my mind was a blur, and all I could focus on was getting back to where there were more people. The farther we moved away, the quieter it got, and by the time we hit the base of the hill, I could still hear the sound echoing in my mind, even though it had stopped. We didn't speak a word to each other as we made our way back to the park. There wasn't any need. Neither of us wanted to acknowledge what we'd just heard. The air felt different now, heavier, like it was pressing down on us. We both knew we'd heard something alive, but it didn't feel like any animal I'd ever heard. It was wrong. Even the sound of the wind in the trees seemed less natural after that. When we got to the park, I felt a little better, but the unease didn't fully go away. It lingered, like the feeling you get after you've been in a dark room for too long and the light suddenly turns on. Your eyes have adjusted, but your mind still doesn't trust what you see. Later, much later, I would remember that feeling, that gut-wrenching reaction. There's only one other time in my life that I've ever experienced anything similar. It was during a field trip in high school at an anatomy lab. The smell of preserved bodies, formaldehyde and something else, something too intense, hit me as soon as I walked in. It was suffocating, almost. The second that smell touched my nostrils, the same feeling washed over me. That deep primal sense that I needed to leave, that something was wrong in a way I couldn't explain. That's what that sound did to me. It was as if my body was telling me, without any hesitation, this is not right. Get out. Get away. It wasn't until we were safely home that night, sitting in my room, that I allowed myself to think about it. My mind started to run through all the possibilities. I had heard strange noises in the woods before. Cows mooing, deer making that soft, high-pitched noise when they were startled, even coyotes howling in the distance. But this was nothing like that. It was alive, but it was wrong. Something that didn't belong. I tried to tell myself it was just a bird, maybe a crow or some other animal I hadn't recognized, but I knew it wasn't. It didn't sound like anything I had ever heard before, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was dangerous, whatever it was. Jeff didn't bring it up either, and I wasn't about to ask. I think we both knew that if we started talking about it, we might make it worse. Maybe the feeling would stick around longer if we gave it words. So we didn't. The next time we ran that trail, a week or so later, I felt it again. That unease. It wasn't like the first time, though. This time, I could feel the weight of it in the back of my mind. It was like the woods knew we were there and were watching. As we neared the ridge, the air felt too thick. We had both been silent for a while, but the quiet was unsettling, like it was waiting for something. I couldn't help it. I glanced behind me. I don't know what I was expecting to see. Maybe just the familiar trail behind us. maybe nothing at all. But when I turned back toward the hill, I saw something. Not far from the base of the hill, standing between the trees, there was a shape. I couldn't make it out at first. My heart started pounding in my chest again. It was tall, and it was dark against the fading light. But it wasn't a cow, and it wasn't a person. It was something else. Something I didn't have a name for. I turned to Jeff. He saw it too. We both froze, eyes locked on the figure. Neither of us moved for a long time. Then it disappeared into the trees. The rest of the run was a blur. We didn't speak. When we made it back to the park, we both knew we weren't going to run that trail anymore. Not for a long time, at least. We never talked about it again, but that night, as I lay in bed, I kept thinking about the sound. The one that had been so wrong, so unnatural. I still don't know what it was, but I know I won't forget it. Something about it stuck with me, deep down in a place that I don't like to think about. We never went back to that ridge. I still don't know what made that noise, or what was watching us that day, but I know whatever it wasn't a part of that peaceful place. It didn't belong there, and for some reason, that made it all the more terrifying. It was late, and I hadn't been able to sleep. The house was quiet now, but the echoes of the fight still lingered in my mind. I sat at the edge of my bed, staring at the wall, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. I could still hear the shouting, the threats, the glass breaking. It was a fight between my dad and my brother, and it had escalated beyond anything I could have imagined. I'd been through some tough times before, but this felt different. It was like the tension in the house had finally snapped. The shouting started as usual, just a disagreement, something minor at first. But then it got worse. My dad's voice raised, and my brother, normally calm, snapped back in anger. I tried to stay out of it, not wanting to get involved, but the intensity of their words filled the entire house, making it impossible to ignore. Then I heard it, the sound of something heavy hitting the ground. I rushed into the living room to find my brother standing over my dad, his fist clenched, his face red with fury. Dad was trying to get up, his hands shaking, but there was no way to calm the situation down. I could see the anger in both of their eyes, uncontrollable, like they were both stuck in some kind of trance they couldn't break. "Get away from him!" I screamed, though my voice was barely a whisper against the noise. My brother didn't listen. He kept shouting, his words slurred with rage. Dad tried to defend himself, but I could see the fear in his eyes, the way he was backing up, trying to stay out of my brother's reach. That's when I saw the knife. I froze. My heart skipped a beat as I watched my brother's hand trembling, holding the blade. It wasn't huge, but in that moment, it felt like the biggest thing in the world. "Stop!" I yelled, panic surging through me. "Don't! Put it down!" But my brother's eyes were wild, and he was barely hearing me anymore. He raised the knife, his hand shaking, and I thought for a moment that everything was going to go too far. My mind raced, heart pounding in my chest, and all I could think was that I needed to get away. I needed to find help. I bolted for the front door, not even knowing where I was running to, just needing to escape. But then I realized something. How could I leave them like this? How could I leave my brother and my dad, both stuck in this nightmare of anger and fear, with no way out? I didn't know what to do. My mind went blank, and all I could think of was that I couldn't handle it. The fight had pushed me to the edge, and for the first time, I felt like maybe it would be better if I just didn't exist. I collapsed onto the front step, the cold air biting my skin, my hands shaking. I grabbed my phone and opened Facebook. Without thinking, I typed out a simple message. Asterisk, please help. I don't know what to do anymore. Asterisk. I hit send, staring at the screen, hoping someone, anyone, would see it and reach out. But deep down, I felt like it was too late. I felt like there was no one who could pull me back from the edge. What I didn't know was that at the same time, my best friend, Kyle, was sitting in his own room, a gun pressed to his head. Kyle and I had always been close. We shared everything, our hopes, our fears, our dreams. But I hadn't known the dark place he'd been in. I hadn't known he was so close to the edge himself. And in that moment, as I sent my message into the void, Kyle was making a decision. The gun was cold in his hands, his fingers tight around the trigger. His phone sat on the table next to him, the screen glowing faintly in the darkness of the room. He had been staring at it for what felt like hours, not knowing whether he should go through with it. But then, just as he was about to pull the trigger, a notification popped up. It was from me. He didn't know what it was at first, didn't even think twice. But something made him pick up the phone and check it. Maybe it was a sign. Maybe he just wanted to see what it was. But when he saw my message, asterisk, please help. I don't know what to do anymore. Asterisk, he froze. The gun fell from his hand, clattering onto the floor. For a moment, he just sat there, staring at the screen. And in that instant, the weight of everything hit him. He wasn't the only one struggling. He wasn't the only one drowning. Without saying a word, Kyle picked up his phone and started typing. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to fix what was broken, but he knew one thing. He had to be there for me. He texted back a simple message. Asterisk, I'm here. You're not alone. Asterisk. In that moment, everything changed. The darkness that had consumed both of us, me with my thoughts, him with his pain, suddenly felt like it had been lifted, even if just for a moment. I read his message, and for the first time that night, I felt something like hope. Maybe I wasn't alone. Maybe I could still find a way out of this mess. Kyle called me, his voice trembling on the other end of the line. Are you okay? He asked, though I knew he was asking more than just about my physical state. He was asking if I was still holding on. I don't know, I whispered, tears welling up in my eyes. I don't know anymore. I'm here, man, he said, his voice steady now, reassuring. We'll get through this together. You're not alone, okay? You hear me? I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. We talked for hours, just talking, sharing everything, our fears, our pain, and most importantly, the small glimmer of hope that had started to light the way. We both promised each other that we'd never let each other go, that we'd be there no matter what. The next day, I called a friend, and together we reached out to people who could help, professionals who knew how to handle situations like this. It wasn't easy, but with Kyle's support and the support of others, I started to find my way back. Looking back, I realized just how close we both were to losing everything. But in that moment, the universe somehow conspired to bring us back. Kyle put down the gun. I asked for help before it was too late. And somehow, against all odds, we both found a way out of the darkness. Sometimes that's all it takes. A phone call, a message, a friend reaching out. And though it doesn't fix everything, it's a start. That day, we saved each other. We found a way back from the edge. And for that, I will always be grateful. It was one of those nights when the air had a chill to it, even though it wasn't cold enough to warrant a jacket. The kind of night where the wind would pick up every so often, and you could hear branches scraping against the side of the house, like the trees were whispering something you couldn't understand. I was 12 at the time, still in that weird stage where I wasn't quite a little kid, but definitely wasn't a teenager either. The house was being worked on, new siding, new windows, the kind of stuff that left tools and ladders strewn around, making everything feel like a construction zone. It was just a regular night, or at least, that's how I thought it was going to be. My bedroom was on the second floor, which, in hindsight, wasn't exactly the safest place when you're a kid prone to imagination. My bed was pushed against the wall under the window, so I had a full view of the streetlights outside if I ever bothered to look. I wasn't the kind of kid who got scared easily, but I also wasn't the kind to ignore noises either. That night, as I tried to drift off, I heard something. It was faint at first, like a tapping, but the kind of tapping that made you wonder if someone was throwing rocks against your window. I didn't panic right away. I convinced myself that it was probably just the wind. The construction site outside the house had ladders leaning against the walls, old boards stacked up, anything that could get blown around by a gust of wind. But as the sound continued, I started to doubt myself. The tapping became a little too consistent. The next sound I heard was the unmistakable noise of something heavy shifting. My brain quickly put together the image of someone climbing a ladder, moving closer and closer to my window. I stayed completely still. I'm sure I wasn't the only one who believed that if you stayed motionless, the danger would go away, like you were invisible. But the longer I lay there, the worse the feeling got. I could hear the soft scrape of what sounded like fingers dragging across the glass. Knocking, just light enough that I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it, but unmistakable all the same. I didn't know what to do. My heart raced, but I kept still, telling myself that maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe it was nothing. But the noise got worse, more persistent, as if whoever, or whatever, was out there had started to get more frustrated. The scratching grew louder, turning into frantic knocking. And then, without warning, I heard the unmistakable sound of the window latch trying to move. The blood drained from my face. There was no mistaking it. Someone was trying to get in. I couldn't breathe. My body was frozen, my chest tight with fear, but there was no way I could just lie there. I bolted out of bed and ran straight to my parents' room. I didn't stop to check if the window was still being tampered with. I just ran. My parents' room was only about 5 feet away, but it felt like the longest distance I'd ever covered. I barged through their door and shook my dad awake, my words coming out in a rush. "Dad, I think there's someone outside my window." It took him a moment to register what was going on, his groggy voice barely audible as he rolled over and sat up. I tried to explain, but I was shaking too much to get the words out clearly. He didn't say much, just nodded and got up. I followed him back to my room, keeping a few steps behind, as if I needed to make sure he was going first in case anything happened. When we got to my room, I could see the faintest light coming through the blinds, the same window where I had heard all the noise. It was still dark outside, but the streetlights outside cast enough light to see that no one was immediately visible. He opened the window and stuck his head out. For a moment, I thought he might call out, but instead, he just looked around. He didn't see anyone on the ladder, didn't see anything suspicious. Just the faint outline of the construction equipment and the stillness of the night. "Nothing out here," he said, his voice calm, but it didn't make me feel any better. I stood in the doorway, my mind still racing, wondering what was going on. That's when he turned back to me. He paused, looking me straight in the eye. "I think I know what's going on," he said, his tone flat. And that's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of the door opening down the hall. A loud creak, followed by the soft sound of footsteps padding across the hardwood floor. I turned to look, confusion and dread spreading through me, and watched as my older brother, disheveled and looking thoroughly embarrassed, walked into my room. He didn't look at me. He didn't say anything. He just walked straight past, straight to the window, and started to fiddle with the lock like it was nothing. My dad didn't say a word. His face slowly morphed from concern to frustration as he crossed his arms and looked at my brother. "Were you trying to sneak back in through the window?" My brother didn't even look up. I locked myself out. I was trying to get in without waking you guys. I couldn't believe it. The weight in my chest that had been building up for what felt like hours. Thinking there was someone out there, that there was a danger creeping in through my window, just dissolved. I felt like an idiot. All that fear, all that tension, and it was just him. My brother, trying to be sneaky and getting himself stuck outside. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. I stood there for a moment, my hands still trembling, the adrenaline still running through my veins. My dad just shook his head and muttered something about needing a better system for when my brother came home late. I thought someone was trying to break in. I said, my voice still shaky. I heard knocking, and it sounded like someone was trying to open the window. My brother looked over at me for the first time, clearly annoyed. "I wasn't trying to get in that way," he muttered. "But I guess now you know." I didn't know how to react. Part of me was relieved, of course, but the rest of me just felt foolish. I'd spent all that time frozen with fear, imagining something much worse than what was actually happening. My heart rate began to slow down, but the realization hit me slowly. The whole thing had been a mix-up, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something unsettling about it. I tried to sleep after that, but my mind kept going back to the sound of the knocking, the way it had felt so real. For a while, I couldn't help but feel like I'd been part of something bigger, even if it turned out to be something small in the end. The second story I remembered was much later, after my parents had divorced. I was in college by then, back home for spring break. The house was empty, except for me and my dog. My mom had moved in with her new husband, and my dad had left, but the house was still mine when I needed it. The same house, the same familiar setting, though it felt different now. One evening, I was sitting in the den, watching TV, when my dog, my little mini dachshund, started barking. She had this way of barking at nothing, and usually I didn't think much of it. But this time was different. She wouldn't stop. Her high-pitched barks were shrill, almost frantic. I called her over, but she didn't come. She was standing by the big floor-to-ceiling window that looked out over the yard, her paws up on the sill, her eyes fixed on something outside. I stood up slowly, walking toward the window, trying to figure out what she was seeing. There were no lights on in the yard, and it was pitch black outside. The moonlight was just enough to make things visible, but it also cast shadows that seemed to shift and move as the wind rustled through the trees. Still, I had no idea what was making her bark like that. I grabbed my phone, typed 911 into the screen as if I might hit send if something went wrong. It wasn't a rational thought. I wasn't actually in danger, but the feeling of being alone, in the dark, with something making my dog lose it. It was enough to make me think twice about everything. I couldn't see anything through the window, not clearly, and I had no idea what my dog was reacting to. I slowly approached the window, trying to stay out of sight so whatever was out there couldn't see me. My dog kept barking, now more agitated than ever. I peeked over her shoulder, trying to see what she was barking at. It wasn't what I expected. A white plastic grocery bag was floating around in the yard, caught in the wind. The moonlight reflected off the plastic, making it look like something else, something eerie, something out of place. It caught just enough light to be visible, but it wasn't anything more than a floating bag, pushed around by the breeze. My dog had been barking at a plastic bag. I stood there for a moment, feeling both relieved and slightly embarrassed. Nothing out there but the wind, nothing out there but a bag moving through the yard. I bent down to pick up my dog, who had calmed down but was still eyeing the window, still upset by what she thought was something sinister. And then I turned off the lights, closed the blinds, and tried to sleep, though the unease lingered for a while. I remember that night so clearly, even though it happened years ago. It wasn't just one of those regular nights where you're lying next to someone you love, in the safety of your own home, with the familiar sounds of your surroundings making you feel at ease. It wasn't that at all. It felt different, like something was wrong, something lurking just out of view, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. We were in my room, just the two of us. The lights were off, the room dark except for the soft moonlight spilling in through the blinds. I didn't think much of it. We were laying in bed, not talking, just quiet, just thinking. It was one of those moments that felt peaceful at first, the kind of moment when you're so comfortable with someone, so safe, that words don't even feel necessary. It was just me and him, Jay, the boy I cared about, the boy who was always warm, always made me feel safe. But then out of nowhere it hit. It wasn't like a loud noise or something physical happening. It wasn't like a door slamming or a window breaking. It wasn't anything like that. It was this sudden, overwhelming feeling of dread, of panic, that gripped me from the inside out. I can't even explain it properly. It wasn't the same as the panic attacks I've had before. Those were more like tightness in my chest, difficulty breathing, that sense of being trapped. This was something else entirely. It was like an icy cold had descended on the room, and no matter how tightly I tried to wrap myself in the warmth of Jay's embrace, I couldn't shake it. I hugged him back, as tightly as I could. I wanted to be close to him, to feel grounded. But it didn't help. That horrible, cold sensation clung to me like a shadow, crawling under my skin, making me want to scream. I could feel it. I could feel that something was there. It was almost like it was watching us, waiting. It wasn't just an uncomfortable feeling. It was evil. I don't know how else to describe it, but that's the only word that fits. Jay was always so warm, and yet in that moment, his embrace didn't feel comforting. His body felt like ice, and it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I pressed myself into him harder, trying to ignore the feeling, trying to make it go away. But it wasn't going anywhere. It was coming from somewhere in the room. I could feel it, like the air was heavy with it. It was subtle, but it was there, a presence I couldn't see but could feel in every fiber of my being. The corner of the room felt wrong. It was like the air itself had turned thick and oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just waiting for us. I'm not sure what made me speak, but I remember saying it so quietly, as if saying it out loud might somehow make it real. Jay, do you feel that? He didn't even hesitate. He pulled back from me just slightly, his face pale in the dark, his eyes wide. Yeah, he whispered. I do. That cold, evil feeling. It's like something's here with us. That was it. Something in me snapped. It was like I had been holding my breath, and the minute he confirmed what I already knew, I couldn't stay still anymore. My body was trembling with fear. That sensation, that presence, it wasn't something I could just ignore. I knew something was wrong. Something was in that room with us. Jay, though, he didn't panic. He was level-headed. He didn't usually let things get to him easily. But I could see in his eyes that he felt it too. I could see that he was scared. So he did the only thing he could think of. He grabbed his phone and called his friend, Matt. Matt was studying to be a youth pastor. So Jay figured maybe he could pray for us. maybe that would help. I didn't even care. I just needed someone to do something. I needed to feel like I wasn't crazy, like I wasn't imagining things. So, I turned the lights on, even though I wasn't sure it would help. It didn't. The room was still heavy, still thick with that feeling. I went back to bed, my heart racing. Jay put Matt on speakerphone, and we waited for him to pray. My mind was spinning, but I tried to focus on the words Matt was saying, tried to push away the dread that clung to my chest like a vice. I don't know how long the prayer lasted, but it felt like forever. It felt like I was trapped in that moment, and every second that passed, I expected something terrible to happen. The room felt lighter when it was over, and the coldness went away. I don't know how to explain it, but when Matt stopped praying, the air shifted. The weight that had been pressing down on me for what felt like hours suddenly lifted. But it didn't end there. Matt asked us a question that would stick with me forever. He asked, "Were you two talking while I was praying?" Jay and I both said no, of course not. We had been silent, listening, praying in our heads. There was no way we were talking. But then Matt said something that made my blood run cold. He told us that, while he was praying, he had heard a voice. A deep, gravelly voice, like something from a nightmare. He said it came through the phone, from our end, telling him to stop. He said the voice was clear, and it was angry. He said it made him feel sick, like an awful, evil presence had overcome him while he was praying. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't even process what he was saying. I felt like I was going to pass out, and all I could think was, what the hell just happened? Jay was already getting up, grabbing his stuff. He was so freaked out, and I didn't blame him. I was scared too, but I didn't want to be left alone. I needed him there, but he couldn't stay. He had to leave. He didn't want to drive home, but he felt like he had to, like it was the only thing that would make the fear go away. So he left, and I was alone. I walked into my dad's room, trying to convince myself that everything was fine, that it was just a weird moment, just a weird feeling. But when I told my dad what happened, he just muttered something about having a gun and shooting it. I don't even know what that was supposed to mean. It wasn't exactly the comforting response I was hoping for, but I wasn't expecting much. My dad wasn't exactly the emotional type. I don't know why I still think about that night. Maybe it's because of the feeling of something being in the room, something that shouldn't have been there. Maybe it's because Matt heard that voice too. Maybe it's because I'll never truly know what it was or what it wanted. The worst part is that I'll never have an answer. The room was lighter after Matt prayed. It wasn't cold anymore. But why? Why did it come? Why did it target us? And why didn't it come back? It felt like it had a purpose, like it was trying to do something. I've never had another experience like that. Never felt that same presence again. But every time I think back to that night, I feel that same panic, that same dread, and I can't help but wonder, what was it trying to do? And why did it leave? I guess I'll never know. And maybe that's the scariest part of all. It was 2009, and I had just returned home for a break from college. I had been looking forward to a few days of peace and quiet, away from the nonstop grind of school. My parents had moved into a new house the year after I left, and while I'd been there a few times, something about the house always unsettled me. It wasn't the kind of place that felt comfortable from the moment you stepped inside. It was big, too big for just my parents. For bedrooms, 2.5 bathrooms, and a 2-car garage. All of that space, but it somehow felt off. I was staying downstairs in the living room, sprawled out on the couch. The sunlight poured in through the windows, and it was a bright, warm Saturday afternoon, around 1 p.m., I remember. I'd just gotten back from a long drive and figured I'd take a quick nap to recharge. The house was quiet, just the usual hum of the fridge and the occasional distant sounds of birds chirping outside. Everything seemed calm. But then, I woke up suddenly, not to the usual sounds of the house settling or the wind outside, but to something distinct, a faint but clear sound of a doorknob jiggling. At first, I tried to ignore it, brushing it off as just my mind waking up from a light sleep. But the noise persisted, rhythmic and somewhat urgent, like someone was trying to get into a room but couldn't. I'd grown up in this house, so I knew it well, but it still didn't feel familiar in the same way it used to. The fact that this was happening in the middle of the afternoon made it all the more bizarre. My mind raced as I pieced together the familiar sounds. The knob that was jiggling was definitely upstairs, on the second floor. I didn't know why, but something felt off. I hadn't heard anyone come in, and the door I could hear clearly was on the second floor, closer to the bedrooms and probably my dad's office. The only explanation I could come up with was that it had to be my dad, home early from work. He sometimes took breaks during the day to run errands or get something to eat. He'd been known to lock himself in the bathroom by accident before. Those old push-and-turn style doorknobs always tripped him up, especially when he was in a hurry or distracted. I figured he'd come home early, gotten a little too frustrated with the door, and was trying to get out. I was a heavy sleeper, so for something to wake me up like that was odd enough in itself. Maybe I hadn't heard the car pull into the driveway or the front door open. Nothing unusual. But whatever it was, it had yanked me from my nap, and now I was wide awake. I wasn't scared at that moment, just curious, maybe a little confused. I had to check on him and help him out, so I got up, stretched, and walked toward the stairs. I made my way upstairs slowly, the house eerily quiet aside from the faint sound of the jiggling knob still echoing in my ears. Each step I took on the staircase creaked under my weight, and I could feel my heart start to race a little. The house was usually quiet, but now it felt as if the air around me had thickened, as if something was subtly shifting in the atmosphere. It wasn't that I felt threatened. It was more like a sense of unease was settling over me, lingering just out of sight. I reached the top of the stairs and glanced around, but there was nothing unusual at first glance. I turned the corner toward the first bedroom, the one where my dad had his office, but the door was wide open. The light inside was off, and everything looked normal. I walked down the hall toward the bathroom, expecting to find him there, maybe muttering about the stubborn doorknob. But as I reached the bathroom, I froze. The door was wide open. The light was off. There was no one in sight. I couldn't explain it. My stomach dropped, a cold feeling creeping up my spine. If my dad was home, the door should have been locked, or he should have been in there. Maybe he'd gone out to the garage to grab something, but even that didn't make sense to me. I checked all the other rooms upstairs. They were all empty. The doors were open, as if no one had been in them at all. It was unsettling. Everything was still. The sense of unease that had started as a quiet nagging feeling now had solidified into full-blown confusion and slight dread. I couldn't wrap my mind around it. Maybe I was just overtired or half dreaming, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I went back downstairs, trying to make sense of it. I sat on the couch, turned the TV on to drown out the silence, and tried to push the strange experience to the back of my mind. The room felt brighter now, thanks to the sunlight pouring in through the windows, but I couldn't shake that nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. Before I knew it, I must have drifted off to sleep again, the drone of the TV in the background making it easier to relax. I woke up again. This time, I wasn't sure how much time had passed. The light outside was still bright, but now there was a definite shift in the atmosphere. The house was too quiet. I strained my ears, and that's when I heard it again. The unmistakable sound of a doorknob jiggling, louder this time, almost violent. It was like someone was desperately trying to get into a room, the sound cutting through the silence like a knife. It wasn't just the usual noise of a knob turning. This was frantic, urgent, like whoever was on the other side was locked out and couldn't get in. I felt my heart race. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't normal. I immediately grabbed my phone and called both of my parents, my fingers shaking as I dialed. My mom answered first, and I could hear her voice, calm and collected, as she told me they were both still at work. Neither of them had come home early. They hadn't even called to say they'd be back soon. My mind reeled. The knob. The sound. It was impossible to ignore now. Whoever was making that noise upstairs was still there. But who? What? I didn't want to go upstairs. I didn't want to face whatever was happening. But I couldn't stay here either. I turned off the TV, the sudden silence almost deafening in its intensity. I sat frozen for a moment, my phone still pressed to my ear, trying to steady my breathing. I had no answers, just questions, and no way of knowing if I was safe, or if I was imagining the whole thing. The thought of checking upstairs was unbearable. The idea of walking up that staircase and seeing. What would I see? It wasn't like the door had been locked. Nothing had been disturbed. The house was still and empty, except for the sounds. I made the decision to leave. I didn't know what else to do. I grabbed my keys, ran outside, and drove. I didn't know where I was going, or what I was looking for. I just needed to get out of that house. Whatever was going on, I couldn't face it. Not then. Not alone. Hours later, when my parents came home, They had no explanation for what I'd experienced. They brushed it off as my overactive imagination, maybe a creaky house or the wind. But I knew what I heard, and that was the last time I ever stayed in that house alone. The feeling of dread stayed with me for a long time after, even after I left for school again. Every time I'd come back to visit, I'd find myself avoiding the upstairs. I'd tell myself it was nothing, but deep down, I knew that whatever had happened that day hadn't been a figment of my imagination. The doorknob jiggling violently, the quiet upstairs, the feeling of being watched. It was real, and I never wanted to go back to that house again. It was one of those crisp, cold nights that seemed to freeze the very air. The kind of night that made everything feel still and quiet. The kind of night where if something stirred, you'd hear it. And for us, something was about to stir. Something that would change the way I saw the world forever. We were spending Christmas at my aunt's house. This wasn't just any regular visit, though. It was our first time seeing her since the divorce. My aunt had been married to a man from Czechoslovakia, a guy with a temper like you wouldn't believe. He'd always had a fire in him, but after the divorce, that fire had turned into something much darker. In the days leading up to our visit, my aunt had been receiving strange, disturbing calls from him. He'd threatened her, told her she'd regret leaving him. It was never anything specific, just vague threats about what he was going to do when he got to her. But no one took him seriously. Not at first. I was just a kid, about 6 or 7 years old at the time. My family had recently immigrated to Canada, and since our house wasn't ready yet, we were staying at my aunt's place. She lived in a small, quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town, a place that felt safe, but you could feel the unease in the air. It didn't help that, during the divorce, my aunt's ex-husband had made things difficult for everyone. The fact that we were strangers in a new country made the tension even worse. On that Christmas Eve, everything seemed normal. We were sitting in the living room, and my aunt was talking about the old days, trying to make the best of a difficult situation. The tree was set up in the corner, its lights flickering in the dim room. The smell of Christmas cookies lingered in the air. My parents and I were supposed to be having a peaceful time, but the sound of tires crunching on gravel outside shattered that illusion. My aunt had been in the den, sitting quietly, probably lost in her own thoughts, when she suddenly stood up. Her face went pale, her expression frozen in fear. I remember seeing her eyes widen as she looked out the window. Her hand trembled as she gripped the armrest of the couch. And then I saw it too. There, at the edge of the property, was her ex-husband. He was walking toward the house, a rifle slung over his shoulder, his movements slow but deliberate. He looked determined, angry. My aunt's ex wasn't a big man, but he had a presence. His narrow eyes were locked on the house as he approached, and I could see the tension in his jaw as he gritted his teeth. My heart skipped a beat. My dad had always been the calm one, the steady one, but even he seemed to tense up at the sight of him. My mom looked worried, glancing from the window to my dad, waiting for him to say something. "Get to the stairs," my dad suddenly commanded. His voice was firm, low, but I could hear the underlying panic. Now, I didn't even question it. I grabbed my mom's hand, and we started running. We didn't make it very far before I heard the sound of my dad locking the door, and then he was up the stairs with us, shouting for my aunt to follow. It was like everything had shifted into slow motion. I remember the quick, frantic pace of our footsteps, the sense of urgency in the air. I could hear my dad shouting something downstairs, but it wasn't clear. My mom was holding me close, pulling me up the stairs, and I didn't dare look back. Upstairs, we made it into the bedroom and locked the door behind us. But we didn't stop there. My dad quickly moved a dresser in front of the door, barricading it as best as he could. It was then that I realized the gravity of the situation. We weren't just hiding from someone who was angry. We were hiding from someone who had already crossed a line. The thought made my stomach churn. I could hear my aunt's ex-husband moving closer to the house. I could hear his boots on the gravel, and then the unmistakable sound of him banging on the front door, demanding to be let in. I didn't understand what was going on, but I could feel the fear in my mom's grip on my hand. The way her fingers dug into my skin was a kind of panic I had never felt before. "Stay quiet," my dad said, his voice much calmer than before, but it carried an intensity one didn't quite grasp. "And stay out of sight." My aunt had disappeared into the hallway, probably trying to find a way to escape to the neighbor's house, but I didn't know where she had gone. My mom and I stayed in the room, as quiet as we could, while my dad was downstairs, waiting, watching. I didn't know it then, but that was the moment my dad became a hero in my eyes. A hero not just for me, but for my aunt, for my mom, for everyone in that house. The next few moments felt like an eternity. I didn't know how long it had been since my dad had gone downstairs, but suddenly, the phone in the room rang. My mom reached for it, her hand shaking, but she didn't hesitate. She called the police, her voice low and shaky as she gave them our address. I couldn't hear everything she said, but I heard the word gun several times, and I understood enough to know that things were about to get bad. And then the worst happened. There was a loud crash downstairs. The kind of sound that cuts through the air and sends a chill down your spine. My mom jumped, and I felt my heart race. That wasn't just the door breaking, it was something much worse. My dad was still downstairs. My mind raced with the thought of what was happening. The fear felt like a physical weight pressing down on me. Moments later, I heard heavy footsteps coming up the stairs. I froze. I felt like I couldn't breathe. The footsteps came closer and closer. My heart pounded in my chest. Then there was a crash. The door to the room burst open with a force that sent the dresser flying back across the floor. And there, standing in the doorway, was my aunt's ex-husband. His face was red with rage, sweat dripping from his forehead. His eyes were wild, and he was holding the rifle in one hand, the other clutching a knife. But he wasn't alone. I saw him glance behind him, and that's when I realized there was someone else with him. Someone else was in the house. I didn't know who it was at first, but it became clear when I saw the old man, my aunt's ex-father-in-law, standing just outside the doorway. He had a knife in his hand. His face was pale and twisted with hatred. His eyes were locked on my mom and me, and I could see the malice in his expression. My dad was gone. He had disappeared into the chaos. The door swung open wider, and my heart nearly stopped when I saw my dad standing in the hall. But he wasn't alone either. He was holding a buck knife, and he was moving toward the ex-husband with a calmness that terrified me even more than the situation itself. The next few moments were a blur. There was yelling, crashing, the sound of bodies hitting the floor. My dad and my aunt's ex-husband were in the foyer, struggling, fighting, the noise deafening as they grappled with each other. It was a fight for survival now. I don't remember much of the next few minutes, just the chaotic sounds from downstairs. It felt like time had stopped, like everything was moving in slow motion. But eventually, I heard the sirens. They weren't far away. The police had arrived. When they burst through the front door, my aunt's ex-husband was on the floor, unconscious. My dad was standing over him, breathing heavily, his clothes torn, his face covered in bruises, but still alive. The police quickly arrested my aunt's ex-husband and handcuffed him, taking him away in a squad car. But the true horror didn't come until the police did a sweep of the house. That's when they found him, my aunt's ex-father-in-law. He had been hiding in the backyard, waiting for us to run out, hoping to finish the job with his knife. The police found him, and after a brief scuffle, they arrested him too. It felt like a lifetime before things started to settle down. My dad was bruised and battered, but he was alive. We were safe. My aunt's ex-husband went to jail, and my aunt got a restraining order against him. He still claimed that they had just wanted to scare us, but the scars of that night were real. They were something none of us would ever forget. As for me, I still carry that fear inside me. But I also carry the memory of my dad who fought to keep us safe, who didn't hesitate for a second to put his life on the line to protect us. He became my hero that night, and even though I didn't fully understand what was going on, I knew one thing for sure: my dad had saved us all. And that's the only thing that matters. I was just sitting there, in the living room of our family's house, the old farmhouse. It was quiet, too quiet, really, as I flicked the Xbox controller between my hands, trying to figure out what I was in the mood to play. It was a slow, hot day, the kind where the sun hung heavy in the sky, making everything feel stuck in place. I could hear the hum of the air conditioning in the background, just loud enough to cover up the usual creaks and groans the house made on its own, but not enough to drown out the stillness outside. We were staying here for the week, a little vacation from everything. It was nice to get away, but sometimes I couldn't help but feel weird in this place. It wasn't that anything bad had happened here. Nothing that would have made sense, anyway, but there was something off about it. Maybe it was because the house was surrounded by miles of empty land. the nearest neighbors being too far away to even be considered neighbors. Just acres and acres of farmland, the kind of land that didn't seem like it should hold any surprises. But sometimes, I'd get this feeling in my gut that something was watching. I shook it off, pushed the feeling aside, and focused on the screen again. I was in the middle of a game when I heard it. At first, it was just a soft noise, barely perceptible, like something shifting outside, like the wind moving against something heavy. But then there it was again, louder this time, a definite scrape, and then something else, a horn blaring. It was so sudden, it made me jump, the noise slicing through the air and punching through the quiet of the house. I froze. My heart thudded. I didn't even realize I had paused the game until I looked down and saw the menu screen, like it was mocking me. It didn't make sense. We were in the middle of nowhere, miles away from the nearest road, and the only car out there was my mom's Camaro, sitting by the old barn. The horn blared again, just as loud, filling the silence around me. I stood up slowly, trying to push the weird feeling building up in my chest to the back of my mind. I had to check. I couldn't just ignore it, not when it was coming from the direction of the car. I grabbed my revolver from the drawer by the TV. Yeah, I always kept it nearby. In this house, it felt necessary. I didn't know why I was already feeling so uneasy, but I figured I should trust my instincts, even if they didn't make sense. I walked to the front door, trying to move quietly, but the old wooden floors creaked under my feet. My hand shook a little as I turned the doorknob and stepped out onto the porch. The sun had just started to dip below the horizon, but it was still light enough that I could see the outline of the Camaro sitting by the barn. The horn kept blaring, like someone was laying on the horn and wouldn't stop. I jogged down the steps, keeping my hand near the revolver in case I needed it. As I got closer to the Camaro, I realized the horn wasn't coming from inside the car. It was coming from the engine. I could hear the low, rhythmic blare, like it was stuck, but there was no one inside the car. No one anywhere near it. I stopped dead in my tracks, my stomach dropping. The horn blared again, but it seemed wrong. It didn't sound like something mechanical malfunctioning. It sounded like something was intentionally making it happen, like someone had a hand on the horn, making it go off. But there was no one in sight. No one at all. I stood there for a long time, my brain trying to catch up to what my eyes were telling me. Nothing seemed right. The air felt heavier than usual, like I was surrounded by something that shouldn't be there. The sound of the horn stopped as suddenly as it had started, and I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. I didn't hesitate. I turned and went back inside, my heart hammering in my chest. It was the kind of feeling you get when you know you've just crossed into something you can't explain. The house was quiet when I stepped inside. Too quiet. It felt off. The air inside had a strange, stale smell, almost like it was too closed in. I couldn't put my finger on it. I went back to the living room, trying to shake off the bad feeling, but just as I passed through the hallway, something caught my eye. Something ran across the room. The hallway was dark, but I saw the shadow move fast, crossing the living room. My heart skipped a beat as I froze. It was too quick for me to make out exactly what it was, but I knew it was something big. Maybe a person. Maybe something else. I bolted down the hallway, gun in hand, my mind racing with possibilities. I got to the sliding glass door and looked out into the dark yard, but there was nothing. No movement. I was breathing hard now, my pulse racing in my throat. I stepped back, confused, adrenaline still pumping. The house felt like it was closing in on me, like I wasn't supposed to be here anymore. I didn't understand it. I turned, my hands gripping the gun so tightly my knuckles were white. There was something wrong, something off. I didn't know what, but I had to get out of there. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my bag, threw my stuff in the back of my car, and I left. I didn't even say goodbye. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was, whatever had happened, wasn't over. I drove straight to my friend's house, told them I couldn't stay there another night, and spent the rest of the week with them. It wasn't just the horn or the thing I saw moving through the house. It was the feeling that had crawled under my skin and was sitting there, waiting for me to figure it out. Weeks later, I went back to visit my grandparents. I didn't tell them about what had happened, but the memory was still fresh in my mind. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling. Maybe I had just been paranoid, or maybe it was something else entirely. One night, I was staying up late at their house, watching series of unfortunate events on the TV. It was peaceful, and I thought I could relax for a bit. My grandparents had gone to bed, leaving me to watch the show on my own. I didn't mean to fall asleep, but I did. I woke up around 3 a.m., cold and disoriented, staring at the TV screen. The DVD menu was on, the volume turned low. That's when I heard it. A scream. It wasn't just any scream. It was a brutal, blood-curdling scream from a woman. I didn't move at first, because I couldn't. It was like I was frozen, my body just completely locked up. The scream echoed in my ears, louder than it should have been, even though it came from somewhere outside the house. It was a kind of scream that made my skin crawl, something raw, something unnatural. I snapped into action, jumping out of the recliner, my heart racing as I bolted for the door. I ran to my grandparents' room, shaking them awake. They told me it was probably just a coyote, maybe even a bobcat, but I didn't believe them. The scream was too human, too real. It was something that no animal could replicate. The next morning, my grandma walked outside to see if there was anything unusual, but she didn't find anything. There was no sign of an animal or anyone else being around. Later, my grandparents told me about the strange occurrences they'd noticed around their house. They said they'd seen a little girl and an older woman, people they recognized as part of their past. The woman was someone who had once taken care of my grandpa when he was sick, but she only appeared when he wasn't well. They didn't know who the little girl was, but she seemed to be around sometimes too. They never talked much about it. They didn't think it was anything supernatural, and I didn't either. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how many strange things had happened here, both at their place and ours. I couldn't shake it, the feeling that something was wrong with that whole farm, the land, and maybe even the house itself. There were too many strange things happening for it to just be a coincidence. It wasn't just the scream or the figure I saw moving through the house. It was everything. It was the weird vibes. It was the sense that something was always there, just out of sight, waiting. Whatever it was, I didn't feel safe on that land. It was 3 in the morning when I woke up. The house was quiet, dark, and cold, just the way it always was at that hour. I was in my basement room, a space that I'd gotten used to over the last couple of years. It wasn't the most comfortable, but it was mine. I had a small bed tucked against one wall, and my nightstand with a few books and some junk on it. The walls were bare, just the cinder block of the basement, but there was a window too, slightly above ground level, which let in a little light during the day. Still, it was mostly cold and dim down there. I was in the middle of a dream, but it wasn't a good one. My mind was drifting in and out of sleep when I heard it. At first, I thought I was imagining things. It was a low, groaning sound, something between a moan and a gasp. It sounded like someone in pain. My body froze, the hairs on my neck standing up. It was coming from the couch. The old, worn-out couch that sat across from my bed. It wasn't even a good couch. It was just there because I didn't know what else to do with it. And it creaked. Always creaked when you moved on it. I lay there for a minute, listening. The groan came again, a long, drawn-out sound that seemed to scrape against the air. I wasn't sure what to think. My mind was foggy, half asleep, trying to process what I was hearing. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe my dad had gotten up to watch TV or something, and I just heard him through the thin basement walls. Yeah, that had to be it. But it didn't go away. I rolled over and glanced at the clock. 3:03 a.m. That sound, it felt wrong, like it didn't belong. I tried to ignore it, pulled the blanket up to my chin, and squeezed my eyes shut. Just get back to sleep, I thought. It's just your imagination. The groan came again, louder this time. It was closer. My heart skipped a beat, and I suddenly wasn't so sure of myself anymore. My room wasn't like a normal bedroom. It was part of a basement, so it was more like a small, semi-private area of the house. The couch was just in my line of sight. The room wasn't big enough for anything to hide in, but there was just enough space between the foot of my bed and the couch that I could see the outlines of the couch cushions. It was dark, but I could make out a shape. I sat up, trying to shake off the sleep. The air felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't quite name. I reached over and grabbed my phone from the nightstand. Maybe I could look at something, get my mind off the noise, but as I did, I heard a rustling sound. It was coming from the couch. I felt a cold shiver crawl down my spine. The hair on my arms stood on end. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to acknowledge it, but the sound, this time it wasn't just a moan. It was something more like a low, strained whimper. Panic started creeping up on me. My instincts were going haywire, telling me something was wrong, something was off. I leaned forward, peeking through the darkness. I could just barely see something, a pair of legs hanging off the edge of the couch. I froze. They were wearing shoes I recognized. Black sneakers. Same ones my friend Greg had been wearing earlier that evening when he stopped by to hang out for a bit. I swallowed hard. It couldn't be him, though. I must have been half dreaming, right? Greg had left hours ago. I was sure of it. But still, the shoes. They were the same. I tried to convince myself I was just overthinking. It had to be some weird combination of being half asleep and hearing things. Maybe it was a trick of the shadows. Maybe the couch was just creaking in a weird way. I didn't want to believe it was real. But then, the groaning came again. This time, it sounded more desperate, more real. I leaned up farther, slowly, pushing myself against the bed frame. The noise stopped for a second, and I squinted through the darkness, trying to make sense of the shape on the couch. The moonlight coming through the window just barely illuminated the figure, but it was enough. I could see the legs more clearly now. They weren't Greg's. The shape was Hispanic, not Greek like my friend. This person was wearing a dark hoodie, and the way the body was curled up on the couch, it didn't make sense. Whoever it was, they were definitely not supposed to be there. I felt a chill run through my veins. For a few seconds, I just stared at the legs. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. My first thought was to do something, anything. I had a small knife on my nightstand, one of those 3-inch blades I kept with me for situations just like this, though I hadn't ever actually used it. But I was frozen. I couldn't make sense of it. Who was this person? Why were they in my room? How had they gotten in? 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind, but none of them were clear. Panic was clouding everything. I knew I needed to act. I needed to do something. My eyes flickered over to the door. The lock. My room had a lock on the outside. That's how it was when we converted the basement into a room. I couldn't lock it from the inside, but there was an old key on the outside, hanging by the door. If I could just get there before this person heard me. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't cooperate. My legs were frozen. My heart pounded so loud I was sure the guy could hear it. But then I remembered something. The lock. I had to get to the lock. I crept toward the edge of the bed, trying not to make a sound. My hand brushed the knife on my nightstand, and I gripped it hard, my fingers trembling. I could hear the man shifting on the couch, his breathing slow and heavy, as if he didn't even realize I was there. Then, just as I was about to stand up, the floor creaked beneath me. His head snapped toward me. I didn't even think. I bolted. I jumped to my feet, slammed my shoulder against the door, and rushed into the hallway. I didn't even know what I was thinking. I just knew I had to get away, had to get out of that room. I ran up the stairs, my heart hammering in my chest. The stairs were cold beneath my feet. My legs burned, but I didn't stop. I didn't even look back. I reached the top of the stairs and bolted into my parents' room, shaking, gasping for air. I was hyperventilating, my chest tight with fear. I tried to say something, tried to explain, but nothing came out. My parents stirred, groggy from sleep. They didn't believe me at first. I was just a teenager, right? I must have been dreaming, must have been having a nightmare. They told me to calm down. But as they started to get up, we heard it. A loud crash from below. Then a heavy thudding noise, like something slamming against the wall. My mom grabbed for her phone, dialing 911, while my dad did something I'll never forget. He went to the living room and grabbed the broadsword that hung on the wall, next to the old suit of armor. He always joked about how it was for emergencies, but now, in the middle of all this, it wasn't funny. I could see the fear in his eyes, but also the resolve. He looked at me and said, "Stay here. Get the cavalry saber from the umbrella stand." I didn't even hesitate. I grabbed it. It was heavier than it looked, and I almost dropped it in my panic, but I held on. A few minutes later, we heard the police outside. The door burst open. My dad and I moved to the top of the stairs as officers flooded the house. They went straight to the basement, where the guy had been locked in. I didn't know what happened after that. The police took care of it all. The man, drugged out of his mind, on PCP they said, had apparently broken in by diving through the basement window. They found that out later. I hadn't heard the glass break, since I took sleeping pills to help me stay asleep, but that's how he got in. They told us it was a citizen's arrest, technically, because I'd locked him in. The whole thing seemed surreal. It felt like a nightmare, but it was real. Too real. That was a few months ago. Things haven't been the same since. My mind keeps going back to that night. The way his legs looked when I first saw them, the fear in my chest as I realized he wasn't just some random person, but someone dangerous. Someone who'd come into my space, into my room, and threaten my safety. It's been hard. The flashbacks, the constant state of alertness, the racing heart when I hear a strange sound. And the shame. The shame of having PTSD from something like that. Something that seems so simple when you tell people. But it wasn't. Not when you're there, not when it's real. But I keep going. I keep living. And I've learned to be more careful. The knife is always within reach now. The lock's always checked. I'm not the same, but I'm alive. And that's something. I remember that night so vividly, even though I wasn't the one who went through it. It wasn't me in the van alone, trying to get out of the parking lot after work, feeling a chill crawl down my spine with every step I took towards the vehicle. It was my mom, and she didn't know in that moment that she was about to experience something so frightening that it would stick with her for weeks. Even now, she can't talk about it without laughing a little, but I know deep down, there's still a part of her that feels the lingering unease from what happened. She worked at the General Motors headquarters in Oshawa, a massive building nestled at the edge of some marshlands. The kind of place where the company's employees were accustomed to walking the trails that bordered the land. On any given day, it wasn't uncommon to see people biking or walking through those trails. They were quiet, peaceful, and offered a nice escape from the constant hum of the factory floor. But after dark, things changed. The company had been sending out memos to the female employees for weeks. There had been an incident, something terrible, on one of those trails just a stone's throw away from the GM building. A violent assault had occurred, and it wasn't just some isolated crime. There was an undercurrent of fear running through the halls of the office, especially when employees clocked out after dark. My mom wasn't one to let it get to her. She'd walk to her van without thinking twice, always confident that she was safe in the familiar environment. But this night was different. It was one of those cold nights in early autumn, when the sun had long since dipped behind the horizon, leaving behind only the pale streetlights to flicker over the nearly empty parking lot. My mom had stayed a little later than usual. She'd been finishing up some last-minute reports, trying to wrap up a busy day. She had just walked out of the building and made her way toward her van when the security guard, who knew her well, gave her the usual half-smile and a polite nod. "Do you want an escort, ma'am?" he asked. It wasn't the first time he'd asked, and it wasn't even out of the ordinary. Most nights, my mom would politely decline. She was a strong, independent woman who never wanted to seem like she couldn't handle herself. But this night was different. The guard, who wasn't a big guy, looked at her with a slight tilt of his head. "You sure? I know it's getting late, and with what's been going on." My mom shrugged it off with a smile, just as she had before. No thanks. I'll be fine, but maybe just keep an eye out for me, all right?" The guard nodded again, his eyes lingering a moment longer than usual before he turned back toward the post. My mom, satisfied with the exchange, continued walking. The parking lot was mostly empty, save for a few cars parked near the building entrance. She could see her van in the distance. The sound of her footsteps echoed softly in the air, blending with the distant hum of the building's lights. The night air was crisp, and she could almost smell the faint scent of wet leaves from the nearby woods. She reached her van without incident and, as she always did, waved at the guard one last time. With a soft grunt, she opened the door and slid into the driver's seat, glad to be done with the day. The radio was still tuned to the same station she had left it on earlier, the quiet voice of a talk show host floating in the background. She closed the door, settled into her seat, and buckled up. Everything was normal, or at least it was, until she heard the voice. "Let's be friends." My mom froze. The words rang out from the back seat, clear as day. She didn't recognize the voice, and for a split second, her mind went blank as a wave of icy fear surged through her. Who could be in her van? Who had snuck in? She hadn't seen anyone around when she parked. She didn't hesitate for a second. With adrenaline pumping through her veins, she flung the door open and scrambled out of the van, her heart pounding in her chest. She could barely register her surroundings as she ran back toward the building, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps. She didn't look back, didn't stop to see if anyone was following her. All she knew was that she had to get back to safety, and she had to do it fast. By the time she made it halfway to the building, the security guard had already spotted her, his flashlight swinging wildly in the darkness. "What's wrong? What's happening?" he asked, breathless. "There's someone in my van," my mom gasped, still trying to catch her breath. "I heard it. It said, 'Let's be friends.'" I don't know who it was, but The guard didn't wait for her to finish. He quickly jogged over to her van, his flashlight scanning every inch of the vehicle, looking for any sign of a person or anything that might be out of place. My mom watched from the sidewalk, her mind racing, still too frightened to think straight. After what felt like an eternity, the guard waved her over. "It's clear. You can come back," he called out. Confused and shaking, my mom made her way over, her eyes darting to the back seat of the van. Her stomach twisted in knots. She was still on edge, the adrenaline coursing through her system, but she had no choice but to check. She stood beside the van, her eyes wide as the guard opened the door and shined his flashlight inside. To her surprise, there was no intruder, no hidden person, no shadowy figure crouching in the corner, just a teddy bear. A Teddy Ruxpin, to be exact. One of those plush toys that spoke when activated by sound. My mom's heart, which had been racing in her chest, suddenly slowed to a stunned crawl as she realized what had happened. The bear, which had been left in the back seat for weeks, must have been activated by the sound of the van door closing. Its mechanical voice had been triggered just as she settled into the driver's seat. The words, "Let's be friends," were nothing more than the toy's pre-programmed speech. A deep, mortifying sense of embarrassment began to replace the terror that had gripped her only moments earlier. She felt her cheeks flush, the tension in her body releasing, and in that instant, she wanted to sink into the ground and disappear. "Well, I guess that's it," the guard said, his voice tinged with a mix of amusement and sympathy. "You okay?" My mom stood there for a moment, trying to process everything. She had gone from feeling sheer panic to complete embarrassment in the blink of an eye. She stared at the teddy bear, now silent in the back seat, and could hardly believe it. "Yeah," she said finally, forcing a laugh. "I think I'm all right now. I'll be fine." The guard gave her a sympathetic nod, though she could see the hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. As she climbed back into her van, she couldn't help but chuckle nervously to herself. The whole thing had been absurd. She had practically run for her life over a teddy bear. The next day at work, she told me the story, and I couldn't help but laugh along with her. But as funny as it was, I knew that for her, the fear of that moment still lingered. After all, who could blame her for reacting the way she did? For all she knew, someone had snuck into her van, someone who had no business being there, and said something as chilling as, "Let's be friends." But sometimes, it's the simplest things that can startle us the most. In the end, my mom was left with two things: a funny story to tell and the knowledge that sometimes our fears are triggered by the most unexpected things, even a forgotten teddy bear. My Nana had a very close friend, someone she'd known since their nursing days. They'd spent so much of their younger years together, both raising their children, working hard, and living life in the best way they could. As time passed, they'd grown into women with families of their own, each with their own challenges, but they'd always managed to keep in touch. Her friend's name was Susan, and she had a terrible ex-husband. From what my Nana told me, this man wasn't a kind man at all, especially towards Susan. He was unpredictable, dark, and had some issues with depression. Despite everything, he still reached out to my Nana, especially in his darker times. They were good friends, and he'd often call her when he was down, needing someone to talk to. One evening, he called, and my Nana could tell by the sound of his voice that something was off. He was having a tough time, feeling very low, and he just wanted someone to listen. She could hear the exhaustion in his words, and she knew he was struggling. But that night, my Nana had just had my father, her newborn, and she was already exhausted from the constant nursing. She had to tell him, gently, that she couldn't come over to see him. She needed rest and time to care for her baby. "I'll see you soon then," he'd said, and with that, the conversation ended. That was the last time she would ever speak to him. Around 9 p.m. that evening, my Nana sat in her chair, feeding my dad. The house was quiet, save for the crackling fire and the gentle sounds of her baby in her arms. Granddad wasn't home yet. He was working the night shift, and she wasn't expecting anyone until the morning. The house felt calm, safe, and still, as it always did when she was alone with the kids. But that calm would not last long. She heard the front gate open. It wasn't a soft gate, but a loud one. The kind of gate you want to have when you live in a quiet neighborhood, especially when you're home alone. She knew the sound of it well. It creaked and groaned with each swing, alerting her to the presence of anyone who was walking up the driveway. At first, she didn't think much of it. She assumed that maybe Granddad had forgotten something or had been sent home early. He had a habit of doing that, especially when the shifts were unpredictable. But as she sat there, her attention shifted to the family dog, Ben. Ben had been with them for years, a steady presence in their home. He was a large, gentle dog, good with kids, never aggressive or skittish. He had always been a friendly, calm dog, one that wouldn't cause a stir without a good reason. But that night, something was wrong. Ben began to growl. At first, it was low, a rumble in his throat, but it quickly grew louder, more urgent. His whole body stiffened, and his fur stood on end. He wasn't moving toward the door, nor was he looking out the window. No, he was staring directly at the door, the one that led into the hallway. My Nana tried to shake off the unease. Maybe he was just hearing something outside. But this wasn't like Ben. He'd never acted like this before. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she felt a shiver run down her spine. It was a feeling she couldn't shake. And then came the barking. Ben barked loudly, his voice a sharp, insistent sound that echoed in the room. My Nana tried to stand, to go check on whatever it was that was making Ben act this way. But she couldn't. She felt frozen. She couldn't move a muscle. It was as if something was holding her in place, as if her own body had betrayed her. She was trapped in the chair, her limbs stiff, unable to react. A coldness settled over her, almost like an icy fog that spread through the room. It wasn't just a chill from the night air. It was deeper than that. It felt as though the temperature had dropped suddenly and dramatically, and she could feel it in her bones. The fire in the fireplace was crackling away, yet she could feel the coldness creeping up her spine, seeping into her very core. It wasn't just the physical sensation. It was the dread that settled in her chest, tightening like a vice. She tried to shake it off, but it wouldn't leave. For 2 minutes, she sat there, trembling, unable to move, her heart pounding in her chest. Ben continued to bark and growl, but my Nana didn't feel the same fear she had before. As quickly as it had come, the icy coldness began to fade, replaced by an unnatural sense of calm. It was as if the world had stopped for a moment, and everything had settled into stillness. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the gate creaked again, signaling the departure of whoever had been there. My Nana couldn't explain what had happened that night. All she knew was that something strange had occurred, something she couldn't put into words. She tried to convince herself it had just been her imagination, a trick of her mind. But the fear and unease stayed with her, lingering like a shadow. The next morning, when Granddad returned home, my Nana explained what had happened. She told him about the gate, the barking dog, and the strange coldness that had come over her. She didn't know what to make of it, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been very wrong. It was then that Granddad told her the news. Her friend's ex-husband, the man who had called her just hours before, had taken his own life. He had died around 8:50 p.m. that evening, just 10 minutes before the sound of the gate had alerted her to someone's presence. He had walked down the long road to their house that night, and for some reason, my Nana had felt it. She had felt it before anyone else had. Ben had sensed it too, his behavior giving her a warning before she even knew what had happened. It was too much for my Nana to process at first. The timing was too strange, too coincidental. She couldn't explain it, and even after all these years, she still couldn't shake the memory of that night. The coldness, the stillness, and the way everything had gone quiet in the house, all of it felt wrong. And to this day, when I hear that story, I can't help but feel a deep chill run through me. My Nana never spoke about it much after that, and neither did my Granddad. But they both knew, in some unspoken way, that something had crossed over that night. Something had happened that was beyond their understanding. As for me, I'll never forget the way my Nana looked when she told me about that night. Her eyes, clouded with the memory of something unsettling, and the way her voice faltered just slightly when she recounted the details. Some things in life can never be explained, and that's one of those things that still haunts me. Even now, whenever I pass by that old gate at my Nana's house, I can't help but wonder, what happened that night? Why had she felt what she felt? And what, exactly, was it that Ben had sensed before any of us knew? It was summer vacation, and I was staying at my grandparents' house, like I always did. I was around 13 or 14, and I had developed a routine that I thought was the best thing ever. Staying up late, eating junk food, and playing video games until my body couldn't take it anymore. My grandparents never really cared about my schedule, as long as I kept the volume down and didn't wake them up. My bedroom was at the very end of the hallway, right across from my grandparents' room. Their door was almost always shut at night, and unless they needed something, they rarely left their room once they had gone to bed. I knew this because I had gotten used to hearing my grandpa's footsteps in the middle of the night. He had this habit of getting up to take some Tums. The cupboard with the Tums was on the other end of the hall, right past the bathroom. His routine was predictable. I could hear the soft vibration of his footsteps through the carpet, the gentle creak of the cupboard door opening, the quiet rustling as he fished around for the bottle, and then the footsteps making their way back to the bedroom. Then, finally, the sound of the bedroom door closing. It was something I had grown used to, something my brain had logged as normal. It happened almost every night, and at this point, I didn't even really pay attention to it. But then, something changed. At first, I didn't think much of it. The footsteps would still come at night, but now they weren't always attached to the same routine. Sometimes, I would hear them at odd hours, way later than usual. If it was past 1 or 2 in the morning, I would open my door to see if I could catch my grandpa walking back to his room. But every time I checked, the hallway was empty. I tried to stay rational about it. Maybe he had just made it back to his room before I opened the door. Maybe I was just hearing things. The house wasn't old, but houses settle, and I knew that sometimes noises could play tricks on you, especially at night when everything was quiet. But as the days passed, I started noticing more. The footsteps became more frequent. Sometimes I would hear them more than once a night. Other times, they would happen in the span of a few minutes, as if someone were pacing back and forth. I would lie there in bed, controller in my hands, screen glowing in the dark, and I would listen. The soft, rhythmic sound of someone walking down the hallway. I told myself it was nothing. After a while, I got used to it. I stopped checking. It wasn't hurting anything, and honestly, I was tired of getting up just to find an empty hallway. The sound wasn't even that loud, just footsteps on carpet, barely noticeable unless you were already awake and paying attention. So I started ignoring it. Then one night, something different happened. I was lying in bed, watching TV. My room was small, just big enough for a bed, a dresser, and a tiny desk that I barely used. The head of my bed was against the same wall as my bedroom door, meaning if someone stood right outside my room, they would be standing just inches from my head. I heard the footsteps again. They came from the other end of the hall, slow and steady, just like always. I ignored them. I focused on my TV. But this time, they didn't stop at the cupboard. They kept coming. I felt my stomach tighten, but I told myself it was fine. My grandpa could just be walking to the bathroom or something. The footsteps got closer. I turned my TV down slightly, just enough so I could hear better. The steps reached my door. And then suddenly, the doorknob rattled. Not a soft, hesitant movement. It was violent, rapid, as if someone was grabbing the knob and twisting it back and forth as fast as they could without actually opening the door. I jumped out of bed so fast that I didn't even think. My heart was slamming in my chest. I reached for the door, yanked it open. Nothing. The hallway was empty, dark as the night outside, quiet as could be. I took a step out, my breath coming fast, trying to see if I had just missed whoever had been there. My grandparents' door was shut. The house was dead silent except for the faint hum of the fridge from the kitchen. I walked over to their room. I didn't knock. I didn't want to wake them up if they were asleep. But I slowly, carefully turned the knob and cracked their door open just a bit. The sound of my grandpa snoring filled the room. I shut the door just as carefully as I had opened it. I stood there in the hallway for a few moments, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My skin was covered in goosebumps. Maybe the doorknob had just been loose, and it moved on its own. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe it was just a noise, just the house settling, just my mind playing tricks on me after weeks of hearing those damn footsteps. I went back into my room and locked the door. I lay in bed for a long time that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the TV. I didn't hear any more footsteps, but I didn't sleep much either.